Into the Dreaming, by Karen Marie Moning, 1, Shum High Matam, not quite Scotland. It was a land of shadows and ice, of grey and greyer and black. Deep in the shadows lurked inhuman creatures, twisted of limb and hideous of countenance, things one did well to avoid seeing. Should the creatures enter the pale bars of what passed for light in the terrible place, they would die, painfully and slowly, as would he, the mortal Highlander imprisoned within columns of sickly light. Should he succeed in breaking the chains that held him and seek escape through those terrifying shadows? Jagged cliffs of ice towered above him. A frigid wind shrieked through dark labyrinthine canyons, bearing a susurrus of desolate voices and faint hellish screams. No sun, no fair breeze of Scotland, no scent of heather penetrated his frozen, bleak hell. He hated it. His very soul cringed at the horror of the place. He ached for the warmth of the sun on his face and hungered for the sweet crush of grass beneath his boots. He would have given years of his life for the surety of his stallion between his thighs and the solid weight of his claymore in his grip. He dreamed, when he managed to escape the agony of his surroundings by retreating deep into his mind, of the blaze of a peat fire scattered with sheaves of heather, of a woman's warm, loving caresses, of buttery, golden-crusted bread hot from the hearth, simple things, impossible things. For the son of a Highland chieftain, who'd passed 10 in resplendent mountains and vales, 5 years was an intolerable sentence, an incarceration that would be withstood only by force of will, by careful nurturing of the light of hope within his heart. But he was a strong man, with the royal blood of Scottish kings running hot and true in his veins. He would survive. He would return and reclaim his rightful place, woo and win a bonny lass with a tender heart and a tempestuous spirit like his mother, and fill the halls of Dunhacon with the music of wee ones. With such dreams he withstood 5 years in the hellish wasteland, only to discover the Dark King had deceived him. His sentence had never been 5 years at all, but 5 fairy years, 500 years in the land of shadow and ice. And on that day when his heart turned to ice within his breast, on that day when a single tear froze upon his cheek, on that day when he was denied even the simple solace of dreaming, he came to find his prison a place of beauty. My queen, the unseelie king, holds a mortal captive. The seelie queeness' face remained impassive, lest her court see how deeply disturbing she found the messenger's news. Long had the seelie court of light and the unseelie court of dark battled. Long had the unseelie king provoked her. "Who is this mortal?" she asked coolly. "Aidan MacKinnon, son and heir of the Norse princess Saucy Mary and Findenus MacKinnon from Dunhacon on the Isle of Skye. Descendant of the Scottish king, Kenneth MacAlpin," the queen mused aloud. "The unseelie king grows greedy, his aim lofty, if he seeks to turn the seed of the MacAlpin to his dark ways. What bargain did he strike with this mortal? He sent his current hand of vengeance into the world, to bring death to the mortal's clansmen, yet bartered that if the mortal willingly consented to spend 5 years in his kingdom, he would spare his kin. And the MacKinnon agreed. And the king concealed from him that 5 years in fairy is 5 centuries still. As grand seed of the MacAlpin, mort suspect the MacKinnon would have accepted the full term to protect his clan. "What concession does the king make?" the queen asked shrewdly. "Any bargain between fairy and mortal must hold the possibility for the human to regain his freedom. Still no mortal had ever bested a fairy in such a bargain. At the end of his sentence, he will be granted 1 full cycle of the moon in the mortal world, at his home at Dunhacon. If by the end of that time he is loved and loves in return, he will be free. If not, he serves as the king's new hand of vengeance until the king chooses to replace him, at which time he dies." The queen made a sound curiously like a sigh. By such cruel methods had the unseelie king long fashioned his deadly prized assassin, his beloved vengeance, by capturing a mortal, driving him past human limits into madness, indurating him to all emotion, then endowing him with special powers and arts. And since the unseelie kind of go was barred entrance to the human world, he trained his vengeance to carry out his orders, to hold no act too heinous. Mortals dared not even whisper the icy assassin's name, lest they inadvertently draw his merciless attention. If a man angered the unseelie king, vengeance punished the mortal's clan, sparing no innocence. If grumblings about the fairy were heard, vengeance silenced them in cruelly imaginative ways. And if the royal house was not amenable to the fairy world, vengeance toppled kings as carelessly as one might sweep a chessboard. Until now it had been the unseelie king's wont to abduct an insignificant mortal, one without clan who would not be missed to train as his vengeance. He went too far this time, the seelie queen brooded, abducting a blood grandson of one of fair Scotia's greatest kings, a man of great honor, noble and true of heart. She would win this mortal back. The queen was silent for a time. Then, what 500 years in that place will do to him, she breathed in a chilling voice. The unseelie Cottonooga had named the terms of his bargain well. Aidan McKinnon would still be mortal at the end of his captivity, but no longer remotely human when released. Once long ago and never forgotten, she had traversed that forbidden land herself, danced upon a pinnacle of black ice, slept within the Dark King's velvet embrace. Perhaps an enchanted tapestry, she mused, to bring the McKinnon the one true mate to his heart. She could not fight the unseelie king directly, lest the clash of their magic too gravely damage the land. But she could and would do all in her power to ensure Aidan McKinnon found love at the end of his imprisonment. My queen, the messenger offered hesitantly, they shall have but one bridge of the moon in the sky. Perhaps they should meet in the dreaming. The queen pondered a moment. The dreaming, that elusive, much-sought, ever-forgotten realm where mortals occasionally brushed pale shoulder to iridescent wing with the fairy. That place where mortals would be astonished to know battles were won and lost, universes born, and true love preordained. From Cleopatra and Mark Antony to Abelard and Helois, the lovers could meet in the dreaming and share a lifetime of loving before they ever met in the mortal realm. It would lay a grand foundation for success of her plan. Wisely spoken, the queen agreed. Rising from her floral bower with fluid grace, she raised her arms and began to sing. From her melody a tapestry was woven of fairy lore, of bits of blood and bone, of silken hair from the great-great-grandson of the McAlpin, of ancient rites known only to the true race. As she sang, her court chanted, "Into the dreaming lure them deep, where they shall love whilst they Deo Tehat sleep. And then in the waking both shall dwell. Love as fire doth melt his ice-born hell." And when the tapestry was complete, the queen marveled. "Is this truly the likeness of Aidan McKinnon?" she asked, eyeing the tapestry with unmistakable erotic interest. "Mort have seen him, and it is so," the messenger replied, wetting his lips, his gaze fixed upon the tapestry. "Unfortunate woman," the queen said silkily. The fairy queen went to him in the dreaming, well into his sentence when he was quite mad. Tracing a curved nail against his icy jaw, she whispered in his ear, "Hold fast, McKinnon. For Mort have found you the mate to your soul. She will warm you. She will love you above all others." And the monster, chained to the ice, threw back his dark head and laughed. And it was not a human sound at all. Two, in present-day Oldenburg, Indiana, Jane Silly had an intensely passionate relationship with her postman. It was classic love-hate. From the moment she heard him whistling his way down her walk, her heart kicked into overtime, a sappy smile curved her lips and her breathing quickened. But the moment he failed to deliver the acceptance letter extolling the wonders of her manuscript, or worse, handed her a rejection letter, she hated him, knew it was his fault somehow, and that maybe, just maybe a publisher had written glowing things about her. He'd dropped the letter because he was careless. The wind had picked it up and carried it off, and even now her bright and shining future lay sodden and decomposing in a mud puddle somewhere. Just how much could a federal employee be trusted anyway? She brooded suspiciously. He could be part of some covert study designed to determine how much one tortured writer could endure before snapping and turning into a pen-wielding felon. "Purple prose, my ass," she muttered, balling up the latest rejection letter. Mort only used black ink. Mort can't afford a color ink cartridge. She kicked the door of her tiny apartment shut and slumped into her second-hand Naugahyde recliner. Massaging her temples, she scowled. She simply had to get this story published. She'd become convinced it was the only way she was ever going to get him out of her mind. Him, her sexy dark-haired Highlander, the one who came to her in dreams. She was hopelessly and utterly in love, Vekep Tehat him. And at 24, she was really beginning to worry about herself. Sighing, she unballed and smoothed the rejection letter. This one was the worst of the lot and got pretty darn personal, detailing numerous reasons why her work was incompetent, unacceptable, and downright idiotic. "But Mote do hear celestial music when he kisses me," Jane protested. "At least in my dreams Mote do," she muttered. Crumpling it again, she flung it across the room and closed her eyes. Last night she'd danced with him, her perfect lover. They'd waltzed in a woodland clearing caressed by a fragrant forest breeze beneath a black velvet canopy of glittering stars. She'd worn a gown of shimmering lemon-colored silk. He'd worn a plaid of crimson and black atop a soft laced linen shirt. His gaze had been so tender, so passionate, his hands so strong and masterful, his tongue so hot and hungry, and Jane opened her eyes, sighing gustily. How was she supposed to have a normal life when she'd been dreaming about the man since she was old enough to remember dreaming? As a child, she thought him her guardian angel, but as she'd ripened into a young woman, he'd become so much more. In her dreams, they'd skip the dance of the swords between twin fires at Beltane atop a majestic mountain, while sipping honeyed mead from pewter tankards. And how could a cheesy high school prom replete with silver disco balls suspended from the ceiling, accompanied by plastic cups of Hawaiian punch, compare to that? In her dreams, he had deftly and with aching gentleness removed her virginity. Who wanted a Monday night football watching, beer drinking, insurance adjuster, frustrated wannabe pro golfer? In her dreams, he'd made love to her again and again, his heated touch shattering her innocence and awakening her to every manner of sensual pleasure. And although in her waking hours she'd endeavored to lead a normal life, to fall for a flesh and blood man, quite simply no mere man could live up to her dreams. "You're hopeless. Get over him already," Jane muttered to herself. If she had $1 for every time she'd have told herself that, she'd own Trump Tower and the air rights above it. Glancing at the clock, she pushed herself up from the chair. She was due at Mope for her job at the Smiling Cobra Cafe in 20 minutes, and if she was late again, Laura might make good on her threat to fire her. Jane had a tendency to forget the time, immersed in her writing or research or just plain daydreaming. "You're a throwback to some other era," Jane Laura had said a dozen times. And indeed, Jane had always felt she'd been born in the wrong century. She did own a car and didn't want one. She hated loud noises, condos, and skyscrapers, and loved the unspoiled countryside and cozy cottages. She suffered living in an apartment because she could afford a house yet. She wanted her Auvet no vegetable garden and fruit orchard, maybe a milking cow to make butter and cheese and fresh whipped cream. She longed to have babies. 3 boys and 3 girls would do nicely. Yes, in this day and age, she was definitely a throwback. To caveman days, probably, she thought forlornly. When her girlfriends had graduated from college and rushed off with their business degrees and briefcases to work in steel and glass high-rises, determined to balance career, children, and marriage, Jane had taken her B.A. in English and gone to work in a coffee shop, harboring simpler aspirations. All she wanted was a low-pressure job that would interfere with her writing ambitions. Jane figured the skyrocketing divorce rate had a whole lot to do with people trying to tackle too much. Being a wife, lover, best friend, and mother seemed like a pretty full plate to her. And if no, she amended firmly, when she finally got published, writing romance would be a perfect at-home career. She'd have the best of both worlds. Right, and someday my prince will come. Shrugging off an all-too-familiar flash of depression, she wheeled her bike out of the tiny hallway between the kitchen and bedroom and grabbed a jacket and her backpack. As she opened the door, she glanced back over her shoulder to be sure she'd have turned off her computer and ran smack into the large package that had been left on her doorstep. That hadn't been there half an hour ago, when she plucked her mail from the sweaty, untrustworthy hands of the postman. Perhaps he'd returned with it, she mused. It was large. It must be her recent internet order from the online used bookstore, she decided. It was earlier than she'd anticipated, but she was to complaining. She'd be blissfully immersed in larger-than-life heroes, steamy romance, and alternate universes for the next few days. Glancing at her watch again, she sighed, propped her bike against the door jamb, dragged the box into her apartment, wheeled her bike back out into the hall, then shut and locked the door. She knew better than to open the box now. She'd quickly progress from stealing a quick glance at the covers, to opening a book, to getting completely lost in a fantasy world. And then Laura would fire her for sure. It was nearly 1 in the morning by the time Jane finally got home. If she had to make one more extra shot, 1/2 decaf, venti double cup, 2 sweet and lows, skim with light foam latte for one more picky anorexic bimbo, she might have done bodily harm to a customer. Why could anyone drink good old-fashioned coffee anymore? Heavy on the sugar, loads of cream, life was too short to count calories. At least that's what she told herself, each time the scale snidely deemed her plump for 5 epo to 3 3/4 inches. With a mental shrug, she scattered thoughts of work from her mind. It was over. She'd have done her time, and now she was free to be just Jane, and she couldn't wait to start that new vampire romance she'd have been dying to read. After brushing her teeth, she slipped out of her jeans and sweater and into her favorite nightie, the frilly romantic one, kept pet, tiny daisies and cornflowers embroidered at the scoop neckline. She tugged the box near her bed before dropping cross-legged on the stuffed, old-fashioned feather ticks. Slicing the packing tape seal with a metal nail file, she paused and sniffed as an irresistibly spicy scent wafted from the box. Jasmine, sandalwood, and something else, something elusive that nudged her past, feeling dreamily romantic to positively aroused. Great time to read a romance, she thought ruefully, with no man to attack when the love scenes heat up. Untouched except in her dreams, her hormones tended to simmer at a constant gentle boil. And with a wry smile, she dug past the purple styrofoam peanuts and paused again when her hands closed on rough fabric. Frowning, she tugged it free, sending peanuts skittering across the hardwood floor. The exotic scent filled the room, and she glanced at the closed casement window, bemused by the sudden sultry breeze that lifted strands of her curly red hair and pressed her nightie close to her body. Perplexed, she placed the folded fabric on her bed, then checked the box. No postmark, no return address, but her name was printed on the top in large block letters, next to her apartment number. Well, Mort met not paying for it, she announced, certain a hefty bill would shortly follow. Mort day not order it, darned if she was paying for something she didn't want. She had a hard enough time affording the things she did want. Irritated that she had no new books to read, she plucked idly at the fabric, then unfolded it and spread it out on the bed, and sat motionless, her mouth ajar. "This is not funny," she breathed, shocked. "No," she amended in a shaky whisper, "this is not possible." It was a tapestry, exquisitely woven of brilliant colors, featuring a magnificent Highland warrior standing before a medieval castle, legs spread in an arrogant stance that clearly proclaimed him master of the keep. Clad in a crimson and black tartan, adorned with clan regalia, both his hands were extended as if reaching for her. And it was him, her dream man. Taking a deep breath, she closed her eyes, then opened them slowly. It was still him, each detail precisely as she dreamed him, from his powerful forearms and oh so capable hands to his luminous aqua eyes to his silky dark hair and his sensual mouth. How she would have loved living in medieval times, with a man like him. Beneath his likeness, carefully stitched, was his name. Aidan McKinnon, she whispered. Mortals did not bide captivity and fare well. They did not age in time stretched into infinity, and Aidan McKinnon was no exception. It took a mere 200 years of being imprisoned in ice, coupled with the king's imaginative tortures, for the Highlander to forget who he'd once been. The king devoted the next 2 centuries to brutally training and conditioning him. He educated the Highlander in every language spoken, and instructed him in the skills, customs, and mores of each century, so that he might move among mankind in any era without arousing suspicion. He trained him in every conceivable weapon and manner of fighting, and endowed him with special gifts. During the 5th and final century, the king dispatched him frequently to the mortal realm to dole out one punishment or another. Eradicating the mortal's confounded sense of honor had proven impossible, so the king utilized dark spells to compel his obedience during such missions, and if the conflict caused the mortal immeasurable pain, the king cared not. Only the end result interested the unseelie king. After 5 centuries, the man who'd once been known as Aidan McKinnon had no recollection of his short span of 30 years in the mortal realm long ago. He no longer knew that he was mortal himself, and did not understand why his king was banishing him there now. But the king knew he owned his vengeance only once he had fulfilled all the terms of the original agreement, the agreement the Highlander had long ago forgotten. In accordance with that agreement, the king was forbidden to coerce him with magic or instruction of any kind. Vengeance was to have his month at Dun Hakon, free of the king's meddling. Still, the king could offer a few suggestions he knew his well-trained vengeance would construe as direct orders. After informing Vengeance, to whom time had little meaning, that the year was Mortbornheimitam, refreshing his knowledge of the proper customs of the century, and giving him a weighty pouch of gold coin, the unseelie king suggested, choosing his words carefully. Your body will have needs in the mortal realm. You must eat, but Moat would suggest you seek only bland foods. As you will it, my liege, Vengeance replied. The village of Kylakin is near the castle wherein you'll reside. It might be best that you go there only to procure supplies and not dally therein. As you will it, my liege. Above all else, it would be unwise to seek the company of female humans or permit them to touch you. As you will it, my liege. A weighty pause then. Must Mort leave you? It is for but a short time, my Vengeance. Vengeance took a final look at the land he found so beautiful. As you will it, my liege, he said. Jane studied the tapestry, running her fingers over it, touching his face, wondering why she'd never thought to try to create a likeness of him before. What a joy it was to gaze upon him in her waking hours. She wondered where it had come from, why it had been delivered to her, if it meant he really existed out there somewhere. Perhaps, she decided, he'd lived long ago, and this tapestry had been his portrait, handed down from generation to generation. It looked as if it had been lovingly cared for over the centuries. Still, that didn't explain how or why it had been sent to her. She'd never told anyone about the strange, recurring dreams of her Highlander. There was no logical explanation for the tapestry's arrival. When baffled, she shook her head, scattering the troubling questions from her mind, and gazed longingly at his likeness. Funny, she mused. She'd been dreaming about him for forever, but until now she had never known his last name. He'd been only Aidan, and she only Jane. Their dream nights had been void of small talk. Theirs had been a wordless love, the quietly joyous joining of two halves of a whole. No need for questions, only for the dancing and the loving, and one day not too far off, babies. Their love transcended the need for language. The language of the heart was unmistakable. Aidan McKinnon. She rolled the name over and over in her mind. She wondered and wished and ached for him, until at last she rested her cheek against his face, curled up, and tenderly kissed his likeness. As she drifted into dreams, in that peculiar moment preceding deep sleep that always felt to Jane like falling, she thought she heard a silvery voice softly singing. The words chimed clearly, echoing in her mind. Free him from his ice-born hell, and in his century you both may dwell. In the dreaming hast thou loved him. Now in the waking must thou save him. And then she thought no more, swept away on a tide of dreams. 3. Motkind Bokum Haitam. Isle of Skye. When Jane wakened, there was a kitten draped across her neck, napping. Paws buried in her curly hair, it kneaded and purred deliriously, its tiny body thrumming with pleasure. She blinked, trying to wake up. Had there been a kitten in the box, too, she wondered, petting its silky belly, feeling terribly guilty for failing to notice it earlier. How had it breathed in the box? Poor thing must be starved. She thought she might have some tuna in the pantry to give the little tyke. Stretching gingerly, she lifted the tiny creature off her neck and rolled over onto her side. And shrieked. "Nell Lake," she sputtered. "There's a lake in my bedroom, 3 feet away from her, deep blue and gently lapping at the shore that she'd have been sleeping on." Stunned, she sat up, performing a frantic mental check. Bedroom gone, apartment gone, tapestry gone, kitten here, nighty. Gone. But so not in the mood for an inadequacy dream, Jane hissed. Purple flowery stuff, here castle, here. Castle? She rubbed her eyes with the heels of her palms. The kitten mewed and gave her an insistent head-butt, demanding more belly-rubbing. She clutched the tiger-striped kitten and gaped at the castle. It looked very much like the castle she visited in her dreams, except this castle was in near ruin. A mere quarter of it stood undamaged. "Moot Met still sleeping," she whispered. "Moot Met just dreaming that Moot woke up, right?" She would have been only mildly surprised had the kitten bared pearly teeth and cheekily replied. But it didn't, so cradling its tiny body. She rose and started walking toward the castle, wincing as her bare feet padded across stones. She tried to imagine herself some dream clothes and shoes, but it didn't work so much for controlling one's subconscious, she thought. As she gazed at the portion of the castle still intact, a square central tower abutted by one wing that sported a smaller round tower, her gaze was caught by a dark flutter atop the walls. As she watched, the flutter became a shirt, the shirt a shoulder, the shoulder a man. Her man. She stood motionless, gazing up. Vengeance could not fathom what had driven him to climb to the top of the tower. He'd intended to sit in the hall of the strange castle, eating only enough to survive, gazing at nothing, waiting to return to his king, but moments ago he'd felt an overwhelming compulsion to go outside. Being outside, however, was disconcerting. No cool shadows and ice, but riotous color and heat, so he climbed instead to the walk atop the tower, where he felt less besieged by the foreign landscape. And there she stood, the lass, bare as she'd have been fashioned. Something low in his gut twisted mayhap the cold, hard bread he'd eaten, he decided. Distantly he acknowledged her beauty. Flames of curly red hair framed a delicate porcelain face, tumbled down her back, and fell in ringlets over her breasts full and high and pink-tipped. Legs of alabaster and rose, slender of ankle, generous of thigh. More shimmering red curls where they met. For a moment he suffered an inexplicable inability to draw his gaze higher. But only for a moment. She clutched a tiny kitten to her breasts, and he had another strange moment, considering the wee beastie's lush perch, assailed by a vague and distant recollection. It eluded him. Unseelie females were icy creatures, with thin limbs and chill bodies. Yet this woman didn't look icy nor slim, but full and generously rounded and soft and warm. It would be unwise to seek out the company of female humans, or permit them to touch you, his king had ordered. Vengeance turned his back and left the tower walk. Jane's mouth opened and shut a dozen times, while he stood at the top of the tower gazing down at her. He disappeared without a word, as if he didn't even know her. as if they hadn't been dream lovers for nearly forever, as if she wasn't even standing there in all her glory, which, if one believed the love words he'd whispered in her dreams, was considerable. Well, Jane Silly thought irritably, if he thinks this is a dream breakup, he's got another thought coming. 4. It was a little difficult to convincingly stomp into a castle nude, even in a dream. One fretted about things like cellulite and what one's bare foot might stomp upon. And so Jane succeeded only, despite her righteous ire, in slinking into the castle, looking rather uncertain, and if her nipples were a weather vane, noticeably chilled. He was sitting before the empty hearth, staring into it. She gazed at the fireplace wistfully, longing for a fire. It might be summer outside, but it was cold within the damp stone walls. Ever chivalrous in her dreams, he would surely accommodate her slightest wish and build a fire. It occurred to her then that she'd never been cold in one of her dreams before. She filed the thought away for future consideration. There was something very odd about this dream. "Aidan," she said softly. He didn't move a muscle. "Aidan, my love," she tried again. Perhaps he was in a bad mood, she thought, perplexed, although he had never been in a bad mood in any of her dreams before. But she supposed there was a first time for everything. Was he angry at her for something? Had she popped in after committing some dream transgression? He still didn't move or respond. "Excuse me," she said not so sweetly, circling around in front of him, using the love-starved kitten as a shawl of sorts, feeling suddenly insecure, wondering what to cover, her breasts or her well. Maybe he wouldn't look down. He looked down. When she lowered the mewing kitten, he looked up. "That's not fair," she said, blushing. "Lend me your shirt." This was not unfolding like one of her dreams at all. Ordinarily, she didn't mind being nude with him because they were either making love in bed or in a pile of freshly mown hay or in a sweet clear loch or on a convenient table. But now he was fully clothed and something was way off kilter. "Please." She extended her hand. When he shrugged, stood up, and began unlacing his linen shirt, her breath caught in her throat. When he raised one arm over his head, grabbed the nape of his shirt in a fist, and tugged it over his head, she swallowed hard. "Oh, Eden," she breathed. "Gorgeous." He was simply flawless, with supple muscles rippling in his arms, his chest, and his taut abdomen. She'd kissed every smooth ripple in her dreams. The sheer visceral beauty of her Highlander hit her like a fist in the stomach, making her knees weak. "Lord Canove kept not why you persist in addressing me by that appellation. Modem vengeance," he said, his voice like a blade against rough stone. Jane's mouth popped open in an O of surprise. "Vengeance?" she echoed blankly, round-eyed. "Then this is a dream, isn't it, Aidan?" It was quite different from her usual dream. In her dreams everything was soft focus and fuzzed around the edges, but now things were crystal clear. A little too clear, she thought, frowning as she glanced around. The interior of the castle was an absolute mess. Grime and soot stained the few furnishings, and cobwebs swayed from the rafters. There was no glass in the windows, no draperies, no sumptuous tapestries, no luxurious rugs. A lone rickety chair perched before a dilapidated table that tilted lopsidedly before an empty hearth. No candles, no oil globes. It was Spartan, gloomy, and downright chilly. He pondered her question a moment. Mort Duna know what dreams are. There was only existing as he had always known it, shadows and ice in his king, and pain sometimes. Pain beyond fathoming. He'd learned to avoid it at all cost. But Mortem not who you think. Jane inhaled sharply, hurt and bewildered. Why was he denying who he was? She narrowed her eyes, studying him, sleek dark fall of hair, same as in her dreams, chiseled face and sculpted jaw. Same brilliant eyes, the color of tropical surf, not the same. Frost seemed to glitter in their depths. His sensual lips were brushed with a hint of blueness, as if from exposure to extreme cold. Everything about him seemed chilled. Indeed, he might have been carved from ice and painted flesh tones. "Yes, you are," she said firmly. "Yuri Aidan McKinnon." An odd light flashed deep within his aquamarine eyes, but was as quickly gone. "Cisva kept to hat that ridiculous name? Modem vengeance," he said, his deep voice ringing hollow in the stone hall. He thrust his shirt at her. Eagerly she reached for it, intensely unsettled, needing clothing, some kind of armor to deflect his icy gaze. As her hand brushed his, he snatched his back, and the shirt dropped to the floor. Doubly hurt, she stared at him a long moment, then stooped and placed the kitten on the floor, where it promptly twined about her ankles, purring. Fumbling in her haste, she swiftly slipped the shirt over her head and tugged it down as far as it would go. The soft fabric came nearly to her knees when she rose again. The neck opening dropped to her belly button. She laced it quickly, but it did little to cover her breasts. His gaze seemed quite fixed there. Taking a quick, deep breath, she skirted the amorous kitten and stepped toward him. Instantly he raised a hand. "Stay, do not approach me, you must leave." "Aiden, don't you know me at all?" she asked plaintively. "Verily, mote have near seen you before, human. This is my place, begone." Jane's eyes grew huge. "Human," she echoed. "Begone?" she snapped. "And go where? Mote don't know how to leave. Mote don't know how mote got here. Hell's bells, mote met not certain mote really am here, or even where here is." "If you want to leave, mote will." He rose and left the hall, slipping into the shadows of the adjoining wing. Jane stared blankly at the space where he'd been. Jane studied the lake a long moment before dipping her finger in, then licking it. The tiger-striped kitten sat back on its haunches, twitching its wide, fluffy tail and watching her curiously. Salt, it was no lake she was surrounded by, but the sea. What sea? What sea abutted Scotland? She'd never been good with geography. She was lucky she could find her way home every day. But then again, she mused, never before in one of her dreams had she bothered to wonder about geography, more evidence that this dream was strikingly abnormal. Jane dropped down cross-legged on the rocky shore, shaking her head. Either she'd gone completely nuts, or she was having her first ever nightmare about her dream lover. And as she sat, rubbing her forehead and thinking hard, the soft syllables of a rhyme teased her memory. Something about saving him, about being in his century. "Jane, silly, you've finally done it," she chided herself. "You've read one too many romance novels. Only in books did heroines get swept back in time, and then they usually ended up in medieval. Oh!" Lurching to her feet, she spun back toward the castle and took a long, hard look at her surroundings. To the left of the castle, some half-mile in the distance, was a village of thatch-roofed wattle and daub huts, with tendrils of smoke curling lazily skyward. A very medieval-looking village. She pinched herself hard. Ow, it hurt. She wondered if that proved anything. "It's not possible," she assured herself. "Moat must be dreaming." "Free him from his ice-born hell, and in his century you both may dwell. In the dreaming hast thou loved him now, in the waking must thou save him." The rhyme, elusive a few moments ago, now resurfaced clearly in her mind. "Impossible," she scoffed. "But what if it isn't?" A small voice in her heart queried hopefully. What if the mysterious tapestry had somehow sent her back to medieval times, accompanied by pretty clear instructions, that if she could save him, she could stay with him in his century? What century was that? Jane snorted and shook her head. Still, that small voice persisted with persuasive logic. "There are only three possibilities. You read dreaming, you read crazy, or you read truly here. If you read dreaming, nothing counts, so you may as well plunge right in. If you read crazy, well, nothing counts either, so you may as well plunge right in. If you were really here and you were supposed to save him, everything counts, so you'd have better hurry up and plunge right in." "I met crazy," she muttered aloud. "Time travel, my ass." But the small voice had a point. What did she have to lose by temporarily suspending disbelief and interacting with her surroundings? Only by immersing herself in her current situation might she be able to make any sense of it, and if it were a dream, eventually she'd wake up. But heavens, she thought, inspecting the landscape, it all seemed so real. Far more real than any of her dreams had ever been. The dainty purple bell-shaped flowers exude a sweet fragrance. The wind carried the tang of salt from the sea. When she stooped to pet the kitten, it felt soft and silky and had a wet little nose. If she was dreaming, it was the most detailed, incredible dream she'd ever had. Which made her wonder how detailed and incredible making love with Aiden in this dream might be. That was incentive enough right there to plunge in. Her stomach growled insistently, yet another thing that had never happened in one of her dreams. Resolutely, she turned back toward the castle. The kitten bounded along beside her, swiping at the occasional butterfly with gleeful little paws, then scurrying to catch up with her again. She would keep an open mind. She resolved as she stepped inside the great hall. She would question him, find out what year it supposedly was, and where she supposedly was. Then she would try to discover why he didn't know her, and why he thought he was vengeance. Aiden sat again as he had before, staring into the empty fireplace. Clad in loose black trousers, boots, and a gloriously naked upper torso, he was as still as death. When she perched on the chilly stone hearth before him, his eyes glittered dangerously. "Moot thought you left," he growled. "I told you, Mordaunt know how to leave," she said simply. Vengeance considered her words. Had his king deliberately placed the female human there? If so, why? Always before, when his king had sent him into the mortal realm, Vengeance had been given precise instructions, a specific mission to accomplish. But not this time. He knew not what war to cause, whose ear to poison with lies, or whom to maim or kill mayhap, he brooded. This was his king's way of testing him, of seeing if Vengeance could determine what his king wanted of him. He studied her. There was no denying it. He was curious about the human. She was the antithesis of all he'd encountered in his life, vibrant with her flaming hair and curvy body, pale porcelain skin and rosy lips, eyes of molten amber fringed by dusky lashes and slanted upward at the outer corners. She had many facial expressions, lively muscles that pulled her lips up and down and many which ways. He found himself wondering what she would feel like were he to touch her, if she was as soft and warm as she looked. "Would you mind building me a fire?" she asked. "And I'm not cold. Nor do you look cold," he added, his gaze raking over her. She looked far warmer than aught he'd seen. "Well, fire. Now please," she said firmly. After a moment's hesitation, he complied with her command, layering the bricks, making swift work of it, never taking his gaze from her. He felt greatly intrigued by her breasts. He could not fathom Vakep. Hatate, it was about those soft, plump mounds beneath the worn linen that so commanded his attention. Were they on his own body, he would have been appalled by the excess fatty flesh, yet gazing upon her he found his fingers clenching and unclenching, desirous to touch, perhaps cup their plump weight in his hands. For a mere human, she had a powerful presence. He considered the possibility that wee as she was, she might be quite dangerous. After all, there were things in fairy minute of stature capable of inflicting unspeakable pain. "Thank you," she said, rubbing her hands together before the blaze that sputtered in the hearth. "Those are peat bricks, aren't they? Mort read about them once." "Aye. Interesting," she murmured thoughtfully. "They don't look like Mut thought they did." Then she shook her head sharply and focused on him again. "What is the name of this castle?" "Dun Hakon," he replied, then started. Where had that name come from? His king had told him naught about his temporary quarters. "Where a moat?" More knowledge he had no answers for. "On Elianachio." "Where?" she asked blankly. "'Tis Gaelic for Misty Isle. We are on the Isle of Skye. Mayhap it was knowledge his king had taught him long ago. He decided there, silent until needed. His king had oft told him he'd prepared him for any place, any time." Jane took a deep breath. "What year is it?" 1428. She inhaled sharply. "And how long have you lived here?" "Moduna live here, mod am to remain but one passing of the moon, mod arrived yestreen." "Where do you live?" "You have many questions," he reflected for a moment, and decided there was no harm in answering her questions. He was, after all, vengeance. Powerful, perfect, deadly, mote live with my king in his kingdom. "And where is that?" "In Fairy." Jane swallowed. She said weakly, "Aye, my king is the unseelie king. Modem is vengeance, and modem perfect," he added, as if an afterthought. "That is highly debatable," Jane muttered. "Nay, 'tis not modem perfect. My Kai Noga tells me so. He tells me Mot will be the most feared warrior ever to live, that the name of vengeance will endure in legend for eternity." Mot met quaking, Jane said dryly, with an aggrieved expression. He looked at her then, hard, her hair, her face, her breasts, then lower still, his gaze lingering on her smooth, bare legs and slender ankles. "You are not at all what Mot expected of humans," he said finally. "Go with it," she told herself. "Since none of this makes any sense, just run with what he's told you and see where it leads." "You aren't what Mot expected of a fairy," she said lightly. "Aren't you supposed to have sparkly little wings?" "I think I'm a fairy," he said carefully. "Then you're a human," she pressed. He looked perplexed, then gave a faint shake of his head. "Well, if you re not a fairy and you re not human, what are you?" His brows dipped and he shifted uncomfortably but made no reply. "Well," she encouraged. After a long pause he said, "Mot will be needing my shirt back, lass. You may find clothing in the round tower down the corridor." He pointed behind her. "Go now." "We not done with this conversation, Aidan," she said, eyes narrowing. "Vengeance." Mot met not going to stop asking questions, Aidan. Mot have oodles of them. He shrugged, rose and wandered over to the window, turning his back to her. "And Mort met hungry, and when Mort get hungry, Mort get grumpy. You do have food, don't you?" He remained stoically silent. A few moments later he heard her snort, then stomp off in search of clothing. "If you not a fairy and you not human, what are you?" Her question hung in the air after she left unanswered, unanswerable. Verily, he didn't know. 5. She was a demanding creature. Vengeance ended up having to make 3 trips into Kylican to acquire those things the lass deemed the bare necessities. It was abundantly clear that she had no plans of leaving. Indeed, she intended to loll in the lap of luxury for the duration of her stay, because he wasn't certain if his liege had arranged her presence as part of some mysterious plan he'd chosen not to impart, and because he'd been told to reside at the castle until summoned, it seemed he must share his temporary quarters. He was greatly uneasy, and just wished he knew what was expected of him. How could he act on his king's behalf if he knew not why he was there? When on his first foray into Kylecan, the only trip made of his own volition while she'd been occupied rummaging through trunks in the round tower, he'd purchased naught but day-old bread so they both might eat that eve. Although he found the heat and colors of the landscape chafing, he was relieved to escape her disconcerting presence, and foolishly believed procuring food might silence her ever-wagging tongue. When she discovered he'd gone shopping without informing her, she'd had tossed her mass of shining curls and scowled, ordering him to procure additional items. The second time he'd spent a fair amount of the gold coin his liege had given him purchasing clean, so mayhap they were a bit scratchy and rough, but he didn't even need them to begin with woolens, meat, cheese, fruit, quills, ink, and 3 fat, outrageously costly sheets of parchment. The parchment and quills, because she'd proclaimed she was a writer, and it was imperative she write every day without fail. At first, he'd been puzzled by her bragging that she knew her letters. Then he realized it was like as not a rare achievement for a mere mortal. He imagined he knew many more letters than she, and if she still needed to practice them, she was a sorry apprentice indeed. Unimpressed with the results of his second expedition, she'd sent him back a third time with a tidy little list on a scrap of parchment, to find more parchment coffee beans or strong tea, a cauldron mugs eating tools, a supply of rags and vinegar for cleaning, soft woolens, down ticks, wine, and unless you wish to fish the sea yourself, fresh fish for the useless furry beastie. Vengeance being ordered about by a wee woman, fetching food for a mouse-catcher. Still, she was a mesmerizing thing, especially in the pale pink gown she dug out of one of the many trunks. Her eyes sparkled with irritation, or as she listed her demands, her breasts jiggled softly when she gestured, then she turned all cooing and tender as she stooped to scratch the beastie behind its furry ears, making him wonder what her slender fingers might feel like in his hair. He was unprepared for one such as she, and wondered why his king had not forewarned him that humans could be so intriguing. None that he'd e'er encountered in his past travels had been so compelling, and his king had e'er painted them as coarse, sullen, and stupid creatures, easily manipulated by higher beings like Vengeance. He did not yet manipulated the smallest portion of his current circumstances, too busy being ordered about by her. Build me a fire, give me your shirt, buy me this, buy me that. What might she demand next, he, the formidable hand of the fairy king's wrath, was almost afraid to find out. Kiss me. What? He said blankly. Kiss me, she repeated with an encouraging little nod. Vengeance stepped back, inwardly cursing himself for retreating, but something about the fiery lass made him itch to flee to the farthest reaches of the isle. At her direction he'd fluffed several heavy-down ticks on the sole bed in the keep. She was happily spreading it kept had soft woolens and a luxurious green velvet throw he'd not intended to buy. He'd have been coerced into taking it by the proprietor, who'd been delighted to hear a woman was in residence at Dunhakon, and had eagerly inquired, "Be ye the new laird and lady of Dunhakon?" Scowling, he'd had flung coin at the shopkeeper, snatched up the bedclothes, and made haste from the establishment. He was beginning to resent that his king had given him no orders. There, in his dark kingdom, Vengeance knew who he was and what his aim. Here he was lost, abandoned in a stifling, garish world he did not understand, surrounded by creatures he could not fathom, with not one word of guidance from his liege. And now the wench wanted him to do something else. Precisely what he wasn't certain, but he suspected it boded ill for him. She was a creature greatly preoccupied with her physical comforts, and down that path, so his king oft said, lay weakness, folly, and ruin. Vengeance had few physical needs, merely food, water, and the occasional hour of rest. Kiss me, she said, making a plump pucker with her lips. She gave the velvet coverlet a final smoothing. Mort think it might help you remember. What exactly is a kiss? He asked suspiciously. Her eyes widened, and she regarded him with amazement. You don't know what a kiss is, she exclaimed. Why should Mort? 'Tis a mortal thing, is it not? She cocked her head and looked as if she were having a heated internal debate. After a moment, she appeared to reach a decision and stepped closer to him. Stoically, he held his ground this time, refusing to cede an in. Mort merely want to press my lips against yours, she said, innocence knitted to a disarming smile. Push them together like so. She demonstrated, and the lush mow of her mouth tugged something deep in his groin. Nay, you may not touch me, he said stiffly. When she leaned closer, he caught a faint scent, something sweet and flowery on her fiery tresses. It made him want to press his face to her hair, inhale greedily, and stroke the coppery curls. He leaned back. Fortunately, the lass was too short to reach his face without his cooperation, or a step stool. You are so stubborn, she said with a gusty sigh. Fine, let's talk then. It's pretty clear we have a lot to talk about. She paused then. He doesn't know what kisses are, she muttered to herself, shaking her head. That's never happened in my dreams before. Perching on the end of the bed, her feet dangling, she patted the space beside her. Come, sit by me. Nay. When the kitten jumped daintily onto the bed and spilled across the velvet coverlet, he scowled at it. You or that bedraggled mop of fur, met fair uncertain which is more useless. At least the beastie does a prattle on so. But the beastie can kiss either, she said archly, and it's not bedraggled, don't insult my kitten, she added defensively. You attribute high value to these kisses of yours, mote scarce believe they are worth much, he said scornfully. That us, because you haven't kissed me yet, if you did you'd know. Vengeance moved, in spite of his best intentions, to stand at the foot of the bed between her legs. He stared down at her. She scooped up the kitten and pressed her lips to its furry head. He closed his eyes and fought a tide of images that made no sense to him. Perhaps you afraid, she said sweetly. He opened his eyes, mote fear nothing. Then why won't you let me do something so harmless? See, the kitten survived unscathed. He struggled with the answer for a moment, then said simply, You may not touch me. 'Tis forbidden. Why not? And by whom? Mote obey my king, and 'tis none of your concern why. Mote think it is. Mote thought you were a man who thought for himself, a warrior, a leader. Now you tell me you follow orders like some little puppet. Puppet? An imitation of a real person fashioned of wood, pulled this way and that by its master. You nothing but a servant, are you? Her delicate sneer cut him to the quick, and he flinched angrily. Who was she calling a servant? He was vengeance, he was perfect and strong, and he was his king as servant. Why did that chafe? Why did he suffer the odd sensation that once he'd not been anyone to serve but a leader in his own right? Why do you obey him? She pressed. Does this king of yours mean so much to you? Is he so good to you? Tell me about him. Vengeance opened his mouth, closed it again, and left the room silently. Where are you going? She called after him. To prepare a meal, then you will sleep and leave me in peace, he growled over his shoulder. Jane ate in bed, alone but for the kitten. Aidan brought her fish roasted over an open fire and a blackened potato that had obviously been stuffed in the coals to cook, accompanied by a similarly charred turnip, then left in silence. No salt, no butter for the dry potato, not one drop of lemon for the fish. Warily, she conceded that she was probably not dreaming. The fare had never been so unpalatable in one of her dreams, and upon reflection she realized that although she'd attended many dream feasts, she'd never actually eaten anything at any of them. Now, she choked it down because she was too emotionally drained to attempt cooking for herself over an open fire. Tomorrow was another day. The tiger-striped kitten, whom she'd christened Sexbot after apologetically peeking beneath her tail, because of the way the little tyke sashayed about as if outrageously pleased with herself, hungrily devoured a tender fish fillet, and then busied herself scrubbing her whiskers with little spit-moistened paws while Jane puzzled over her situation. She'd been astonished to discover Aidan had no idea what a kiss was, but the more she thought about it, the more sense it made. Aidan not only didn't know he was Aidan, he didn't remember that he was a man, hence he didn't recall the intimacies of love-making. She wondered if that made him a virgin of sorts. When they finally made love, and there was no doubt in her mind that they would one way or another, even if she had to ambush and attack him, would he have any idea what it was all about? How strange to think that she might have to teach him, he who'd been her inexhaustible dream tutor. He certainly hadn't liked being provoked, she mused. He'd grown increasingly agitated when she'd mocked him for obeying his king, and had visibly bristled at the idea of being a mere servant. And still, despite such promising reactions, he had a formidable shell that was going to be difficult to penetrate. It would help if she knew what had happened to him. She needed to make him talk about his king, and find out when and how they'd met. Were there indeed a fairy king? Perhaps the being had enchanted him. The idea taxed Jane's credulity, but all things considered, she supposed, she couldn't suspend disbelief without suspending it fully. Until she reached some concrete conclusions about what was going on, she would be unwise to discount any possibilities. Whatever had happened to him, she had to undo it. She hoped it wouldn't take too long, because she wasn't sure how long she could stand watching her soulmate glare at her Vekepte. The hat blatant distrust and dislike, withholding kisses, refusing to let her touch him. You have 1 month here, Vekepte hat him no more, a woman-silting voice whispered. When Sexbot stopped grooming, paw frozen before her face, she arched into a horseshoe shape and emitted a ferocious hiss. Well, what? Jane stammered, glancing about. Cease with your absurd protestations that this place is not real. You are in the 15th century, Jane Silly, and here you may stay if you succeed. You have but one full cycle of the moon in the sky to make him remember who he is." When Jane opened her mouth, closed it, and opened it again, but nothing came out. Sexpot suffered no such problem, growling low and long. Gently smoothing the spiked hairs on the kitten's back, Jane wet her lips and swallowed. "That's impossible. The man will hardly speak to me. And who are you?" she demanded. Moat Met talking to a disembodied voice, she thought, bewildered. Was Mort Met not the one who does to no worry about him? "And on to be crypt, who are you?" Jane hissed. And there was no reply. After a few moments, Sexpot's back no longer resembled a porcupine-ess, and Jane realized that whoever had spoken was gone. "Well, just what am Mort supposed to do?" she shouted angrily. A month wasn't a whole lot of time to figure out what had happened to him, and to help him remember who he was. She'd like to know who was making up the rules. She had a bone or two to pick with them. Aidan appeared in the doorway, glancing hastily about the chamber. Only after ascertaining she was alone and in no apparent danger did he speak. "What are you yelling about?" he demanded. Jane stared at him, framed in the doorway, gilded by a shaft of silvery moonlight that spilled in the open window, his sculpted chest bare, begging her touch. She was suddenly stricken by two certainties that she felt in the marrow of her bones, that as the woman had said, she truly was in the 15th century, and that if she didn't help him remember, something terrible beyond her ability to imagine would become of him. Would he live and die the icy inhuman creature he had become, perhaps turn into something even worse? "Oh, Aidan," she said, the words hitching in her throat. All her love and longing and fear were in his name. "Moten vengeance," he snarled. "When will you accept that?" When he spun about and stalked from the chamber, Jane sat for a long time, looking around, examining everything anew, wondering how she could have thought for even a moment that she might be dreaming. The reason everything had seemed so real was because it was so real. She fell back onto the bed and stared at the cobwebby ceiling through the shimmer of silent tears. "I want to lose you, Aidan," she whispered. Hours later, Vengeance stood at the foot of the bed, watching her sleep. He'd passed a time of restless slumber on the floor in the hall, and awakened intensely agitated. His rest had not been of the kind he'd known in Fairy. An edgy, mostly aware state of short duration. Nay, he'd fallen into deep oblivion for far longer than usual, and his slumbering mind had gone on strange journeys. Upon awakening, his memory of those places had dissolved with the suddenness of a bubble bursting, leaving him with the nagging feeling that he'd forgotten something of import. Troubled, he'd sought her. She was sprawled on her back, pink gown bunched about her thighs, masses of fiery curls about her face, the kitten of which she seemed strangely fond, and it was too stringy to be palatable over a fire, nor was it capable of useful labor. Hence her interest in it baffled him, was also sprawled on its back, and had managed to insinuate itself into her hair. Its tiny paws curled and uncurled while it emitted a most odd sound. A bit of drool escaped its thin pink lips. Cautiously, Vengeance lowered himself onto the bed. The lass stirred and stretched, but did not awaken. The kitten curled itself into a circle and purred louder. Gingerly, Vengeance plucked up a ringlet of her hair and held it between his fingers. It shimmered in the moonlight, all the hues of flame, golden and coppery and bronze. It was unlike aught he'd seen before. There were more colors in a simple hank of her hair than had been in the entirety of his world until yesterday. He smoothed the curl between his thumb and forefinger. The kitten opened a golden eye and stared at Vengeance's dark hand. It did not flee him, he mused, which confirmed he was to Fairy, for 'twas well known that cats loathed fairies. On the other hand, it didn't attempt to touch him, which he supposed meant he was to human either, for the thing certainly flung itself at the lass at every opportunity. So what am Moat? Sliding his hand beneath her tresses, he sneaked a quick glance at her. Her eyes were still closed, her lips slightly parted, her breasts rising and falling gently. 2 hands. It felt so good. There certainly was a lot of touching going on in this place. Even the kitten seemed to crave it, and she touched everything. Petted the beastie, stroked the velvety coverlet he'd procured in Killican, and would have touched him a dozen times or more. He'd seen it in her eyes. "Kiss me," she'd said, and he'd nearly crushed her in his arms, intrigued by this pressing of the lips she'd described. The mere thought of touching such warmth did alarming things to his body. Tentatively, he touched the tip of his index finger to her cheek, then snatched it away. The kitten buried its pink nose in her hair. After a moment's pause, Vengeance did too, then rested his cheek lightly against it, absorbing the sensation against his skin. "Why do you obey him? Is he so good to you?" Vengeance tried to ponder that thought. His king was well his king. What right did Vengeance have to question whether his liege was good to him? It was not his place. Why not? For the first time in centuries, unhampered by the constant coercion of the king's dark spells, an independent thought sprouted and thrust down a thick taproot in his mind. He had no idea whence such a blasphemous thought had come, but it had, and it defied his efforts to cast it out. Pain lanced through his head behind his eyes. Excruciating pressure built at his temples, and he clamped his hands to his ears as if to silence voices only he could hear. "Aiden, come quickly, would have something to show you. Da brought me a baby pine marten." A lass's voice, a lass who'd once been terribly important to him, a wee child of 8, about whom he'd had fretted and tried to protect. "Mary, she'll be fine with the wee pet," a mannish voice said. "But we resailin' out on the morrow." Mary protested 'tis wounded and might harm her without meanin' to. "Aiden has a way with the wee creatures, and he'll watch were his sister." "Aiden," he breathed, testing the sound of it on his tongue. "Vengeance," he whispered after a moment. Neither name fit him like skin on bones, neither place he'd been, neither his land of ice nor this isle felt like well-worn boots broken in and suited to the heel. He suffered a fierce urge to claw his way from his own body, so strange and ill-fashioned did it suddenly seem in his king's land he knew who he was and what purpose he served, but here he knew nothing. Nothing but pain in places deep in his head and tingles in places deep in his groin. Warily he eyed the pale curves of her legs peeking from the hem of the gown. How smooth they looked, how warm. He squeezed his eyes tightly shut, envisioning his beloved home with his king. "Be ye the new Laird and Lady of Dunhachan?" the shopkeeper queried brightly in his mind, obliterating his soothing image of ice and shadow. "Nay," he whispered, "modum vengeance." 6. The villagers descended upon the castle at daybreak. Jane awakened slowly, feeling disoriented and vulnerable. She'd not dreamed of Aiden, and if she'd had suffered any remnants of doubts that she was in the 15th century before she'd have fallen asleep, they were gone now. She'd never slept through an entire night without at least one dream of her Highland love. At first she wasn't certain what had awakened her, then the clamor of voices rose in the hall beyond the open door of the bedchamber. High-pitched and excited, they were punctuated by stilted, grudging replies in Eden's deep burr. Swiftly she performed her morning ritual of positive reinforcement by announcing brightly to the empty bedchamber, "It's today. What better day could it be?" She'd read somewhere that such small litanies were useful in setting one's mood, so she recited it each morning without fail. Yesterday was a memory. Tomorrow was a hope. Today was another day to live and do one's best to love. In her estimation, that was pretty much all a person could ask. Kissing the drowsy kitten on the head, she slipped from the bed, quickly stripped off her wrinkled dress, then donned the simple yellow gown she'd unearthed yesterday while going through the trunks. She was looking forward to wearing it, because it was undeniably romantic with its low laced bodice and flowing skirt. Coupled with the complete lack of undergarments in any of the trunks, she felt positively sinful, ready for her man at any moment. How she hoped it would be today. Casting a quick glance about the room, she narrowed her eyes thoughtfully. She was going to want a few more items from the nearby village, and soon specifically a large bathtub and whatever medieval people used for toothpaste and soap. Lured by the hum of voices, she hurried from the bedchamber. Vengeance backed against the hearth like a cornered animal. A dozen yammering villagers thrust baked goods and gifts at him and prattled non-stop about some legend and how delighted they were to have a McKinnon back to watch over them. How they would serve him faithfully. How they planned to rebuild his castle. Him. Bekepateke hot over them. He'd as soon sweep his hand and raise the room, leaving naught but bones and silence. But he kept both his hands, and the fairy gifts of destructive power his king had given him, carefully behind his back, because he didn't know what the blethering hell his liege wanted. Rage simmered in his veins. Rage at the villagers, rage at his liege, stunning him with its intensity. Then she sauntered in, and some of the rage dissipated, ousted by discomfort of another sort, slightly more palatable but no less disconcerting. She was a sunbeam flickering about the gloomy interior of the hall. As he watched in tense silence, she smiled and spoke and took the villagers' hands in hers, welcoming the entire ragamuffin lot of them into what had been, for a blissfully short time, his quarters alone. How and when had he so completely lost control of himself and his environ, he wondered. Was control something the fates leached away slowly over a period of time, or a thing instantaneously annihilated by the mere appearance of a female? Enterwoman's at order. Knock. How they were smiling at her, beaming and adoring, clearly accepting her as their lady. "She's not a McKinnon," he snapped. Best he swiftly disabused them of the foolish notion that he was laird and she lady. All heads swiveled to look at him. "My lord." one of them said hesitantly after a pained pause. "'Tis not of our concern if ye've handfasted her, or no, we were simply pleased to welcome ye both." "Noramoda McKinnon," he said stiffly. A dozen people gaped, then burst into uneasy laughter. An elderly man with silver hair, clad in russet trews and a linen shirt, shook his head and smiled gently. "Come," he beckoned, hastening from the hall into the adjoining wing. Hawley irritated with himself for doing so. Vengeance sought the last gaze. He was so accustomed to obeying orders that making simple decisions, like whether or not to follow the elder, paralyzed him. He despised the confusion he felt, despised being left to his own devices. When she stepped toward him, looking as if she planned to tuck her hand through his arm, baring his teeth in a silent snarl, he spun around and followed the old man. Better his own decisions, he decided, than to rely upon her. A few moments later, he stood in the round tower watching the elderly man remove dusty woolens draped over objects stacked behind an assortment of trunks near the wall. The elder seemed to be looking for one item in particular, and upon locating it, devoted much care to wiping it free of dust. Then he swiveled it about and propped it in front of him, where all could see. Vengeance sucked in a harsh breath. The elder had uncovered a portrait of a dark-haired girl sitting between a man and a woman. The man bore an eerie resemblance to himself. The woman was a beauty with wild blonde tresses. But the little girl, merely gazing upon her, filled him with pain. He closed his eyes, his breathing suddenly rapid and shallow. "But you canna leave me, Aidan. Ma and Da hae gone sailin', and moat canna bear to be alone. Nay, Aidan, dinna be leavin' me, moat for terrible feelin' you willna be comin' back." But this Aidan, whoever he was, had had to leave. He'd had no choice. Vengeance wondered who the man and child were and how he knew of them, but such thoughts pained his head, so he thrust them from his mind. 'Twas none of his concern. "'Tis Findanus and Saucy Mary, with their daughter Rose," the old man informed him. They promised centuries ago that although the keep might be abandoned, one day a McKinnon would return, the village would prosper, and the castle would be filled with clan again. "Modem not a McKinnon," Vengeance growled. The elder retrieved yet another portrait of 3 men riding into battle. Even Vengeance was forced to concede his resemblance to them was startling. "'Tis Duncan, Robert, and Niles McKinnon. The brothers were killed fighting for Robert the Bruce more than a century ago. The keep has stood vacant since. The remaining McKinnon resettled easterly, on the mainland." "I'm no kin of theirs," Vengeance said stiffly. The lass who'd invaded his castle snorted. "You look just like them. Anyone can see the resemblance. You're obviously a McKinnon." "'Tis an uncanny coincidence, naught more." The villagers were silent for a time, watching their elder for a cue. The old man measured him for several moments, then spoke in a tone one might employ to gentle a wild animal. "When we came to offer our services, we brought food, drink, and materials to rebuild. We will arrive Aiksay hat morn at daybreak, and remain as your servants till dusk. We pray ye choose to remain with us. 'Tis clear ye are a warrior and a leader. Whatever name ye go by, we would be pleased to call ye laird." Vengeance felt a peculiar helplessness steal over him. The man was saying that whether he was McKinnon or not, they needed a protector and they wanted him. He felt a simultaneous disdain, a sense that he was above it all, yet a tentative tide of pleasure. He longed to put a stop to it, to cast the villagers out, to force the female to leave, but not being privy to his king's purpose in sending him there, he couldn't lest he undermine his liege plan. It was possible that his king expected him to submit to a fortnight of mortal doings, to prove how stoically he could endure, and demonstrate how well he would perform amongst them in the future. There was also the possibility that since he was his king's emissary in the mortal realm, he might have future need of this castle, and his king intended the villagers to rebuild it. He shook his head, unable to fathom why he'd been abandoned without direction. "Oh, how lovely of you to offer," the lass exclaimed. "How kind you all are. We'd love your help. Moat met Jane, by the way," she told the elder, clasping his hand and smiling Jane Silly. Vengeance left the tower without saying another word. Jane. He rolled the name over in his mind. She was called Jane. "Jane Silly," he whispered. He liked the sound of it on his lips. His head began to pound again. "What's ailing him, milady?" Elias, the village elder, asked after Aidan had departed and introductions had been made all around. "He suffered a fall and took a severe blow to his head," she lied smoothly. "It may be some time before he's himself again. His memory has suffered, and he's uncertain of many things." "Is he a McKinnon from one of their holdings in the east?" Elias asked. Jane nodded, ruing the lie but deeming it necessary. Mort was fair certain. "There is no mistaking the look," Elias said. "Since the battle at Bannockburn, they left the isle untended, busy with their holdings on the mainland. Long have we prayed they would send one of their kin to stand for us, to reside on the isle again." And so they have, but he was injured on the way here, and we must help him remember, Jane said, seizing the opportunity offered, grateful that she now had co-conspirators. Touch him frequently, although it may appear to unsettle him, she told them. Won't believe it helps, and bring children around, she said, remembering how in her dreams Aidan had adored children. The more the better, perhaps they could play in the yard while we work. We in Eden labor like a serf, milady, a young woman exclaimed. Mote intend to be part of rebuilding our home, Jane said firmly. Our home, how she liked the sound of that. She was gratified to see a glint of appreciation in the women's eyes. There were several approving nods. And also, Mort heard somewhere that familiar scents can help stir memories, so if you wouldn't mind teaching me to bake some things you think he might like, Mort'd be most appreciative. Mort met afraid. Mort met not the best cook, she admitted, but Mort met eager to learn. More approving nods. Jane beamed. Her morning litany really did help. Today was turning out to be a fine day after all. 7. And so they settled into a routine with which Jane was pleased, despite Aidan's continued insistence that he was not a McKinnon. Days sped by too quickly for Jane's liking, but small progress was being made both with the estate and with the taciturn, brooding man who called himself Vengeance. Each day Jane felt more at home at Dunhakan, more at home with being in the 15th century. As promised, each morning at mote of daybreak the villagers arrived in force. They were hard workers, and although the men departed in the late afternoon to tend their own small plots of land, the women and children remained, laboring cheerfully at Jane's side. When they swept and scrubbed the floors, scraped away cobwebs, polished old earthenware mugs and platters, candlesticks and oil globes, and aired out tapestries, hanging them with care. They repaired and oiled what furniture remained, stored beneath cloths saturated with the dust of decades. Before long the great hall sported a gleaming honey-blonde table and a dozen chairs. The sole bed had been lavishly, and with much giggling by the women, covered with the plumpest pillows and softest fabrics the village had to offer. Sconces were reattached to the stone walls, displaying sparkling globes of oil with fat, waxy wicks. The women stitched pillows for the wooden chairs and strung packets of herbs from the beams. The kitchen had fallen into complete rubble decades ago, and it would take some time to rebuild. After much thought, Jane decided it wasn't too risky to suggest the piping of water from a freshwater spring behind the castle and direct the construction of a large reservoir over a four-sided hearth, guaranteeing hot water at a moment's notice. She also sketched plans for counters and cabinets and a massive centrally located butcher's block. In the meantime, Jane was learning to cook over the open fire in the great hall. Each afternoon the women taught her a new dish. Unfortunately, each evening she ate it with a man who refused to eat anything but hard bread, no matter how she tried to tempt him. Late into the twilight hours, Jane scribbled busily away before the fire, sometimes making notes, sometimes working on her manuscript, all the while peeking at Aidan over her papers and writing the future she hoped to have with him. She liked the laborious ritual of using quill and ink, the flames in the open hearth licking at her slippered toes, the hum of crickets and soft hooting of owls. She relished the complete absence of tires screeching, car alarms pealing, and planes flying overhead. In all her life she'd never experienced such absolute awe-inspiring stillness. By the end of the first week of renovations she'd begun to draw hope from Aidan's bewildered silence. Although he refused to speak to her, day by day he participated a bit more in the repairs to the estate. And day by day he seemed a bit less forbidding. No longer did she see disdain and loathing in his gaze, but confusion and uncertainty, as if he didn't understand his place and how he fit into the grand scheme of things. Jane intended to use her mouth as wisely as possible. She learned in her psychology courses at Purdue that attacking amnesia head-on could drive the person deeper into denial, even induce catatonia. So, after much hard thought, she decided to give Aidan 2 weeks of absolutely no pressure, other than acclimating to his new environment. 2 weeks of working, of being silently companionable, of not touching him as she so longed to do, despite the misery of being with him but forbidden to demonstrate her love and affection. After those 2 weeks she promised herself the seduction would begin. No more baths in Kalakin in one of the village women's homes. She would begin bathing before the fire in the hall. No more proper gowns in the evening. She would wear lower bodices and higher hems. And so Jane bided her time, cuddled with Sexpot in the luxurious bed, and dreamed about the night when Aidan would lay beside her and speak her name in those husky tones that promised lovemaking to make a girl's toes curl. When Aidan stood on the recently repaired front steps of the castle and stretched his arms above his head, easing the tightness in his back. The night sky was streaked with purple. Stars twinkled above the treetops, and a crescent moon silvered the lawn. Every muscle in his body was sore from toting heavy stones from a nearby quarry to the castle. And although he'd learned to avoid pain in the land of shadows, the current aches in his body were a strangely pleasurable sensation. He'd refused to participate in the repairs at first, withholding himself in silent and aloof censure, but much to his surprise, as he'd watched the village men work, he'd begun to hanker to lift, carry, and patch. His hands had itched to get dirty, and his mind had been eager to redesign parts of the keep that had been inefficiently, and in places hazardously constructed. When pondering the 3 commands his king had given, he'd concluded there was nothing to prevent him from passing time more quickly by working. When, on the 3rd day, he'd silently joined the men, they'd worked with twice the vigor and smiled and jested more frequently. They asked his opinion on many things, leading him to discover with some surprise that he had opinions, and further that they seemed sound. They accepted him with minimal fuss, although they touched him with disconcerting frequency, clapping him on the shoulder and patting his arm. And because they weren't females, he deemed it acceptable. When they asked the occasional question, he evaded. He completely ignored the lass who doggedly remained in the castle, leaving only to traipse off to the village, from whence she returned clean and slightly damp, and fragrant smelling, and warm and soft and sweet-looking. Sometimes merely gazing upon her made him hurt inside. Vengeance shook his head, as if to shake thoughts of her right out of it. With each passing day, things seemed different. The sky no longer seemed too brilliant to behold, the air no longer too stifling to breathe. He'd begun to anticipate working as Zay because in the gloaming he could stand back and look at something. A wall recently shored up, steps relaid, a roof repaired, an interior hearth redesigned. And know it was his doing. He liked the feeling of laboring, and rued that his king might deem it a flaw in his character, unsuitable for an exalted being. And each day, when his thoughts turned toward his king, they were more often than not resentful thoughts. His Kai-Na-Go might not have bothered to inform him of his purpose at Dun Hakan, but the humans were more than willing to offer him ample purpose. Purpose without pain, without any pain at all. He had a blasphemous thought that took him by surprise and caused a headache of epic proportions that throbbed all through the night. He wondered if mayhap his king mightn't just forget about him. 8. Swiftly did one blasphemous thought breed another, the next more blasphemous, making the prior seem nearly innocuous. Swiftly did traitorous thought manifest itself in traitorous action. It was on the evening of the 11th day of his exile, when she was laying her meal on the long table in the great hall, that vengeance began his fall from grace. He'd labored arduously that day, and more than once his grip had slipped on a heavy stone. Furthering his unease, wee children from the village had played on the front lawn all afternoon. The sound of their high voices bubbling with laughter as they chased a bladder ball at the edge of the surf or teased the furry beastie with woolen yarns had reverberated painfully inside his skull. Now he sat in the corner, far from the hearth, chewing dispiritedly on hard bread. Of late he'd been eating loaf after loaf of it, his body starved by his daily labors. Yet no matter how much bread he consumed, he continued to lose mass and muscle and to feel lethargic and weak. He knew 'twas why his grip had slipped today. Of late, when she spread the table with her rich and savory foods, his stomach roiled angrily, and on previous evenings he'd left the castle and walked outdoors to avoid temptation. But recently, indeed, only this morning, he thought long and hard about his king's remark concerning sustenance, and had scrutinized the precise words of his command. You must eat, but Moat would suggest you seek only bland foods. Mort would suggest. It was the most nebulous phrase his liege had ever uttered, I would suggest. That was not at all how his king spoke to vengeance. It made one think the king might be uncertain of himself, unwilling, for some unfathomable reason, to commit to a command, and bland. How vague was bland? An engraved invitation to interpretation, that word was. After much meditation, vengeance concluded for himself, a thing coming shockingly easier each day, that apparently his king had suffered some uncertainty as to how hard vengeance might be laboring, so he'd been unable to anticipate what sustenance his body would require. And thus he had suggested, leaving the matter to vengeance discretion. As his king had placed such a trust in him, vengeance resolved he must not return to his king weakened in body and risk inciting his displeasure. When he rose and joined her at the table, her eyes rounded in disbelief. "We'll dine with you this eve," he informed her, gazing at her, nay, lapping her up vaccepte at his eyes. The tantalizing scent of roasted suckling pig teased his nostrils. The glorious rainbow hues of fiery-haired Jane, clad in an emerald gown, teased something he couldn't name. "No bread," she managed, after an incredulous pause. 'Tis not enough to sustain me through the day's labors. I see, she said carefully, as she hastened to lay another setting. Vengeance eyed the food with great interest. She served him generous portions of roast pork swimming in juices and glazed with a jellied sauce, roasted potatoes in clotted cream with chive, some type of vegetable mix in yet another sauce, and thin strips of battered salmon. As a finishing touch, she added several ladles of a buttery-looking pudding. When she placed it before him, he continued to eye it, knowing he'd not yet gone too far. He could still rise and return to his corner to his bread. Moat would suggest. He glanced at her. She had a spoon in her mouth and was licking the clotted cream from it. That was all it took. He fell upon the food like a ravening beast, eating with his bare hands, shoving juicy, deliciously greasy pork into his mouth, stripping the tender meat from the bones with his teeth and tongue. Christ, it was heavenly, rich and succulent and warm. Jane watched astonished. It took him less than 3 minutes to devour every morsel she'd placed on his plate. His aquamarine eyes were wild, his sensual mouth glistening vey. Capte had juices from the roast, his hands. Oh God, he started licking his fingers, his firm pink lips sucking, and her temperature rose 10 degrees. Elation filled her. Although he'd never admitted that he'd been ordered to eat only bread, she'd figured it out herself. Each night, while Sheedy dined, he'd shot furtive glances her way, watching her eat, eyeing the food with blatant longing, and a time or two she'd heard his stomach rumble. More, he shoved his platter at her. Unhappily, she complied, and a third time until he sat back, sighing. His eyes were different, she mused, watching him. There was something new in them, a welcome defiance. She decided to test it. Mort, don't think you should eat anything but old bread in the future, she provoked. Mort will eat what I deem fit, and 'tis no longer bread. Her lips ached from the effort of suppressing a delighted smile, but don't think that that's wise, she pushed. Mort will eat what Mort wish, he snapped. Oh, Aidan, Jane thought lovingly, fighting a mist of joyous tears, well done, one tiny crack in the fade, and she had no doubt that a man of Aidan's strength and independence would begin cracking at an alarming rate now that it had begun. If you insist, she said mildly. Do, he growled, and pass me that wine and fetch another flagon. Feel a deep thirst coming on. Centuries of thirst for far more than wine. Aidan couldn't get over the pleasure of eating. Sun-warmed tomatoes, sweet young corn drenched with freshly churned butter, roasts basted with garlic, baked apples in delicate pastry, smothered vekepete hat cinnamon and honey. There were so many new, intriguing sensations. From the fragrance of heather on the autumn breeze, the salty rhythmic lick of the ocean, when he swam in it to bathe each eve the brush of soft linen against his skin. Once when no one had been in the castle, he'd removed his clothing and stretched naked on the velvet coverlet. Pressed his body into the soft ticks, pondered lying there with her, but then he caught a rash from the coverlet that had made the part of him between his legs swell up. He'd swiftly dressed again and not repeated that indulgence. Unfortunately, the rash lingered, manifesting itself at odd intervals. There were unpleasant sensations, too, sleeping on the hard, cold floor, whilst she curled cozily in the overstuffed bed with the beastie, the tension of watching the lass ankles and calves as she sauntered about, the sickness he felt in his stomach when he gazed upon the soft rise of her breasts in her gown. He'd have seen much more than that yestreen, when the audacious wench had tugged a heavy tub before the fire and proceeded to fill it with pails of steaming water, and sprinkle it with herbs. He'd not comprehended what she was doing until she'd been as naked and rosy-bottomed as when she'd arrived at the castle a fortnight past, and then he'd been too stunned to move. Feeling strangely nauseous, he'd finally gathered his wits and fled the hall, chased by the last soft derisive snort. He'd warred with himself on the newly laid terrace, only to return a quarter-hour hence, and watch her from the shadows of the doorway where she couldn't see him. Swallowing hard, endeavoring to slow his breathing, to stop the thundering of his blood in his veins, he'd watched her soap and rinse every inch of her body. When his hands were trembling and his body aching in odd places, he'd closed his eyes, but the images had been burned into his brain. 13 more days, he told himself. Less than a fortnight remained until he could return to his king. But with each day that passed, his curiosity about her grew. What did she ponder when she sat before the hearth staring into the flames? Why had she no man when the other village women did? Why did she watch him with that expression on her face? Why did she labor so over her letters? Why did she want him to touch her? What would come of it were he to comply? And the most pressing question of late, as his thoughts turned less often to his king, and more often to that puzzling pain between his legs or the hollow ache behind his breastbone. How long would he be able to resist finding out? 9. "What are you writing?" Aidan asked casually, his tone implying that he cared not what she replied, or even if she did. And although her heart leaped, Jane pretended to ignore him. They sat in chairs with most catty corner angles near the hearth in the great hall, she curled near a table and 3 bright oil globes, he practically inside the hearth atop the blaze. He'd been surreptitiously watching her across the space of 6 feet for over an hour, and his question was the first direct one he'd asked of her, since her arrival at Dunhaken, that didn't concern castle matters. Concealing a smile, she continued writing as if she hadn't heard him. He rose from the chair so abruptly that it toppled over, crashing to the floor. His aquamarine eyes glittering with desire, he ripped the sheaf of papers from her hands and threw them aside. He towered over her, his intense gaze seeming to delve into her very soul. "Forget these papers. Forget my question. Moat want you, Jane," he said roughly. "Moat need you now." He began to strip, unlacing his linen shirt, tugging it over his head. He pressed a finger to her lips when she began to speak. "Hush, lass, doona deny me. 'Tis no use Moat will have you this night. You are mine, and only mine, for all of ever, then yet another day." "Why another day?" she whispered against his finger, her heart hammering with nervousness and anticipation. She'd never been with a man before, only dreamed of it, and the dark Highlander standing before her was every inch a dream come to life. He flashed her a seductive grin as he unknotted his plaid, and let it slip down over his taut buttocks' lean muscular hips. Bracing his hands on the arms of her chair, he lowered his head toward hers. "Because not even forever with you will be enough to satisfy me, sweet Jane," Moat met a greedy, demanding man. Mort said, "What are you writing?" His voice was tight. His hard body glistened bronze in the shimmering light of dozens of oil globes. "Moat can resist you, lad knows." "Moat tried," he groaned, his voice low and taut with need. "Moat think about you day and night. Moat can sleep for wanting you. 'Tis a madness Moat fear will never abate." Jane swallowed a dreamy sigh and paused, quill poised above the paper. She arched a brow at him, outwardly calm while inwardly melting. His eyes flashing in his dark face, he coiled tensely in his chair, as if he might leap up at any moment and pounce. "Oh, if only—" "Why do you care?" she said with a shrug, trying to sound nonchalant. She was sick of being patient. She knew that the presence of the villagers, the laboring with his hands on what had once been his home, and his nocturnal spying upon her in the bath were beginning to take a toll. She'd been wise to take a passive role for the past 2 weeks, but it was time to be more proactive. She had 12 days, and she was not going to lose him. "You do nothing without purpose," he said stiffly, "but merely wish to know your purpose in practicing your letters so faithfully each eve." Jane pressed her quill to parchment again. He tugged her up from the chair, crushing her body against the hard length of his own. Gazing into her eyes, he deliberately rocked his hips forward so she could feel his huge cock-kneed. Hard and hot, his impressive erection, he throbbed, pressing through the thin silk of her gown. Jane blew out a breath of pure sexual frustration. Writing love scenes sure could be sheer torture for a girl with no man of her own, and placed the quill aside. Sexbot promptly jumped onto the small side table and attacked the feather, shaking it violently, rescuing the quill before the kitten shredded yet another one. She hesitated before answering. She knew that one inadvertent misstep might drive him back into his rigid shell. He'd made it clear he would never permit her to touch him. She had to find a way to coax him to touch her. "Moat met not practicing my letters. Moat write stories." "What kind of stories?" Jane stared at him hungrily. He was so damned sexy sitting there. Only yesterday he'd taken to wearing a plaid for the first time since his arrival, saying it was cooler to work in. There he sat looking just like her Aidan, clad in crimson and black and no shirt. His upper body glistened with a faint sheen of sweat as he perched as close to the fire as he could get. "You wouldn't understand any of it," she said coolly. "Understand what?" he said angrily. "I understand many things." "You wouldn't understand what Mort write about," she goaded. "Mort write about human things, things you couldn't possibly understand. Remember you not human," she pressed. "By the way," she added sweetly, "have you figured out yet what you actually are?" There, she thought, smugly. He looked incensed. Her Aidan was a proud man, and did like to be belittled. Over the past week he'd begun to display resentment toward anything resembling a direct order which pleased her and made her suspect that he would defy her outright were she to issue a firm command. Anger and confusion warred behind his eyes. "Mort have been laboring with other humans. You do not know what Mort can and can't understand." "Never read my stories," she said sternly. "They are private. It's none of your business, Aidan." "And so long as Madam Laird of this castle, everything is my—" He broke off with a stricken expression. "Laird of this castle," she echoed, searching his gaze. He hadn't even bothered to chastise her for calling him Aidan. He stared into her eyes a long moment, then said stiffly, "Moat meant that the villagers think Moat am, so if you are to live here in what they think is my castle, you should abide by that perception too. Or find another place to live, lass." "That's all Moat meant," he snapped, then pushed himself angrily up from his chair. But at the doorway he cast a glance over his shoulder, so full of frustrated longing, so rife with desire that it sent a shiver up her spine. It was plain to see that he was beginning to feel all the things he'd once felt, but couldn't understand them. Much later, Jane scooped up her papers in one arm and Sexspot in the other. She kept exactly which scene of the manuscript she was working on to inadvertently leave lying about tomorrow. 10. From the first time he kissed her slowly, brushing his lips lightly back and forth, creating a delicious sensual friction until hers parted, yielding utterly. The second, deeper, even more intimately, and the third so possessively that it made her dizzy. His silky tongue tangled Vekepite at hers. He fitted his mouth so completely over hers that she could scarcely breathe. If a kiss could speak, his was purring, "You are mine forever." Subsequent kisses blended wet and hot and intoxicating one into another until her head was reeling. She trembled, burning with the scorching heat of desire. She whimpered when he traced the curve of her jaw, down her neck to the top of her breast. His touch evoked a blend of lassitude and adrenaline that made her feel strong and weak at the same time. Soft and supple, yet close to aggression. Hot and needy and achy. His aquamarine eyes promised lovemaking that would strip bare far more than her body. Gently slipping the sleeves of her gown from her shoulders, he bared her breasts to his hungry gaze. The chilly air coupled with the molten promise in his eyes made her breasts feel tight and achy. When he lowered his dark head and captured a pouty nipple in his mouth, she whimpered with pleasure. When he buried his face between her breasts, slipping her gown down over her hips, she pressed her honeyed womanhood against him, clinging. His lips seared her sensitive skin. He scattered light kisses across her tummy, nipping and nibbling, then dropping to his knees before her. She could barely stand, her knees so weak with desire, and when his hot tongue pressed to her hotter flesh, lapping sweetly at her passion juice's most private heat, she nearly screamed with the exquisiteness of it. Jane stood in the doorway of the great hall, a smile curving her lips, watching Aidan. 15 minutes ago, she'd informed him that she was going to take a quick nap before beginning preparations for their evening meal. She'd headed for the bedchamber, conveniently leaving a few pages of her manuscript lying beside the hearth as if forgotten. He'd nodded nonchalantly, but his gaze had betrayed him by drifting to the parchment. Shortly after retiring to the bedchamber, she'd crept back to the hall. He was standing by the fire, reading so intently that he didn't even notice her standing in the shadows of the stone doorway, watching as his eyes narrowed and his grip tightened on the parchment. After a few minutes he wet his lips and wiped beads of sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "Feel quite rested now," she announced, striding briskly into the hall. "Hey!" she exclaimed, feigning outrage that he was snooping. "Those are my papers! Mot told you not to read them!" His head shot up, his eyes were dark, his pupils dilated, his chest rising and falling as if he'd run a marathon. He shook the parchments at her. "What are these scribblings?" Vengeance demanded in a voice that should have been firm but came out sounding hoarse. His chest felt tight, that heavy part of him betwixt his legs. Oh, Christ, it hurt! Instinctively, he palmed it through the fabric of his kilt to soothe it, hoping the pain would diminish, but touching it only seemed to make it worse. Appalled, he removed his hand and glared at her. She seemed to find the gesture quite fascinating. Jane cornered him and tried to grab the papers from his hand, but he held them above his head. "Just give them back," she snapped. "Mortuna thinks so," he growled. He stood looking at her, her jaw, her neck, her breasts. "This man you write of," he said tensely. "He has dark hair and eyes of my hue." "So," she said, doing her best to sound defensive. "'Tis me you write about," he accused. When she made no move to deny it, he scowled. "'Tis in no fashion a proper woman might write." He broke off, wondering what he knew of proper women when he knew naught of female humans but what he'd learned from her. He studied her, trying to think, which was immensely difficult with parts of his body behaving so strangely. His breath was too short and shallow, his mouth parched, his heart pounding. He felt intensely alive, all his senses stirring, demanding, starving for touch. "This pressing of the lips of yours makes one feel as if one is." He glanced back at the papers, burning with the scorching heat of desire. He who'd long been cold ached to feel such heat. "Yes, if a man's any good at it," she said archly. "But you're not a man, remember? It probably wouldn't work for you," she added sweetly. "You do know that," he snapped. "Trust me," she provoked. "Moat doubt you have the right stuff." "Moat do know what this right stuff of yours is. But mote know that mote formed like a man, he said indignantly. Mote look as all the villagers do. He thought hard for a moment. Verily, mote believe mote more well-formed than the lot of them, he added defensively. My legs more powerful, he said, moving his plaid to display a thigh for her. See, and my shoulders are wider. Motem greater of height and girth, with no excess fatty parts. He preened for her, and it was everything she could do not to drool. More well-formed? Sheesh! And the man could drive the sails of Playgirl right through the roof. Whatever, Jane said, purloining one of her teenage niece Jessica's most irritating responses, guaranteed to provoke, issued in tones that implied nothing he could say or do might interest her. You would do well not to dismiss me so lightly, he growled. They stared at each other for a long tense moment, then he glanced back at the parchment. Regardless of whether mote met human or no, 'tis plain from your writings that you wish me to do such things to you. His tone challenged her to deny it. Jane swallowed hard. Should she pretend to order him not to? Should she concede? She was on tricky terrain, uncertain what would push his buttons just a teeny bit further. He was so close to falling on her like a ravening beast. And God, how she wanted him to. As fate would have it, her very indecision provoked him correctly. As she hesitated, nibbling on her lower lip, a thing she did often while thinking hard, his gaze fixed there, his eyes narrowed. You do wish me to, he accused, else you would have denied it outright. She nodded. Why? He asked hoarsely. It will her make me happy, she managed lamely, twirling a strand of hair around her finger. He nodded, as if that were a fine excuse. After a moment's hesitation, he croaked. You wish this now, at this very moment? Here? He fisted his hands, half crumpling the parchment. His blasted voice had risen and dropped again like a green laddess. He felt incomparably foolish, and yet also as if he faced a moment of ineluctable destiny. Jane's throat constricted with longing as she gazed at him. She wanted him every bit as much as she needed to breathe and eat. He was necessary to the care and feeding of her soul. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Vengeance stood motionless, his mind racing as King had ordered that he not permit a human female to touch him, but he said nothing about vengeance touching a human female. There was this thing inside him, this great gnawing curiosity. He wondered if there was such a thing as burning with the scorching heat of desire, and if so, just how it might feel. If mote do this, you may not touch me, he warned. Mote can touch you, she echoed. That's so ridiculous. Don't you wonder why your king made up that idiotic rule? You will do as I demand. Mote will do this thing as you have written, only if you vow not to touch me. Fine, she snapped. Anything to get his hands on her. She cheerfully acquiesced to being tied to the bed if she must. Intriguing thought, that. When he stepped forward, she tipped her head back and gazed up at him. He glanced swiftly at the parchment, as if committing it to memory. First, mote am to brush my lips lightly across yours. You are to slightly part yours, he directed. Mort think we can play it by ear, she said, leaning minutely nearer. Praying fervently that he would change his mind, she felt she might combust the moment he touched her. So long had she ached to feel his hands on her body. He glanced back at the parchment with a look of alarm and confusion. You mentioned naught of ears in your writing. A mote to do something with your ears, too? Jane nearly whimpered with frustration. Snatching the parchment from his hands, she said, It's a figure of speech, Aidan. It means we, Luglunk, figure it out as we go along. Just begin, you'll do fine. Mote promise. Mote met, merely trying to ascertain we both know our proper positions, he said stiffly. The hell with proper, Jane thought, moistening her lips. Vekepte had her tongue and gazing up at him longingly. The last thing she wanted from him was proper. Touch me, she encouraged. Warily he leaned closer. Jane swayed forward, drawn like a magnet to steel. She wouldn't be satisfied until she was clinging to him like sarin wrap. Although she was forbidden to out-and-out touch him, once he touched her, she certainly could press against him. But still he didn't move. Would you please just start already? Motem not quite certain. Mort know what your most private heat is, he admitted reluctantly. What was happening to him, he wondered. Complying with his demand, she was not touching him, but the tips of her breasts nearly brushed his chest. He could feel the heat of her body and an alarming urgency flooding his. What Luglung help you find it, she assured him fervently. You read too short, he hedged. It took Jane 2 seconds to retrieve the small footstool from beside the hearth, plop it down at his feet and stand on it. It put them nose to nose, a mere inch apart. She stared at him, heart thundering. And he stared silently back. Their breath mingled. His gaze dropped from her eyes to her lips, back to her eyes, then lips again. He wet his lips, staring at her. Jane kept her hands behind her back so she wouldn't touch him, knowing he'd use it as an excuse to leave. It was intensely intimate, such closeness without actually touching, and the way he was looking at her, with hunger and heat. A small sound escaped her. He answered in kind, then looked startled by his involuntary groan. Jane scarcely dared breathe, waiting for him to move that last tiny half-inch. His dark, raw sexuality coupled with his innocence of lovemaking was an irresistibly erotic combination. The man was an expert lover, of that she had no doubt, yet it was as if it were his first time ever, and each touch would be an undiscovered country to him. She gave a quarter inch, and he met her halfway. His lips touched hers. God, they were cold, she thought, stunned. God, she was warm, he thought, stunned, blazing. Fascinated, vengeance pressed his mouth more snugly to hers. He knew he was supposed to use his tongue somehow, but wasn't certain he understood the mechanics of it. Taste me, she breathed against his lips. Taste me like you would lick juice from your lips. Ah, he thought, understanding. Mesmerized by the softness of her lips, he touched the tip of his tongue to them, running it over the seam, and when her lips parted, he tasted her like he was trying to remove a bit of cream from the center of a pastry. She was infinitely sweeter. And then his body seemed to take over, to understand something he didn't, and with a hoarse groan, he plunged his tongue into her mouth and crushed her against him, locking his arms securely behind her back. But that wasn't good enough, he quickly decided. He needed her head just so he slipped his hands deep into her hair and clamped her face firmly, kissing her until they were both breathless. It was incredible, he marveled, stopping to stare at her. He touched a finger to his own lips. They were warm. And she got prettier when he kissed her, he thought, awestruck. Her lips got all swollen and cushy-looking. Her eyes sparkled like jewels, and her skin grew rosy. He'd have done that to her, he thought with pride. He could make a lass prettier merely by pressing his lips to hers. 'Twas a gift his king had ne'er told him he possessed. He wondered how much prettier she'd get if he touched his lips to her in other places. "You are lovely, lass," he said in a voice utterly unlike his own normal tone. Indeed, it came out raspy and thick. "Nay, do na speak," Mordhaven finished. He pressed his lips to hers again, swallowing her words. With butterfly-like touches, his thumbs caressed smooth circles on the delicate skin of her neck, along the line of her jaw and over her face. Then he drew back and ran his fingers lightly over her face, as if he were blind, absorbing the feel of every plane and angle from the downy soft brows to the pert nose and high bones of her cheeks, from the shape of her widow's peak to the point of her chin. Her soft, lush lips. When he rested a finger there too long, she gently sucked the tip of it, and heat lanced straight down to his groin. The vision of her lips closed full and sweetly around his fingernail made him crazed, reminded him of something else, long forgotten, something a lass might do that was sweeter than heaven. His breath caught in his throat. She stared at him, her amber eyes glowing, wide, trusting her lips around his finger. It made him nearly mad with some kind of pain in his breast. Taking her face between his hands, he kissed her as if he could suck the heat of her right into his body, and indeed it seemed he did. "Motvay kept a note to touch you till your skin smells of me," he growled, not knowing why, every inch of it. But Jane understood. It was a purely male way of marking his territory, loving his woman until she bore his unique scent from head to toe. She whimpered assent into his mouth, her hands curled into fists behind her back because it was killing her to not touch him. Then he lifted her from the stool, crushing her against him completely, holding her weight as if she were light as a feather, and his hard, hot arousal pressed into the V of her thighs. Moat met dying, vengeance realized dimly, the feel of her body against that swollen part of him that seemed to have never recovered from whatever rash he'd caught from the coverlet burned and throbbed angrily. He must be dying, because no man could withstand such pain for long. Mayhap, he thought, once he'd undressed her, as she'd directed in her parchments, he could doff his tartan too, and she might tell him what was wrong with him. But nay, he would press his lips to hers a few more times, for she might see the thing betwixt his legs and be disgusted, flee him, for now he was warm, so warm. He slipped his hands from her hair and down over her breasts. He shuddered, once, twice, and 3 times before losing complete control of himself. He had no idea what he'd done, lost to a madness of sorts, until he stood looking at her as she perched atop the small stool, naked tatters of her dress scattered across the floor. He had no clear memory of ripping her gown away. So urgent and fierce had his need been to bear her completely to his touch. "Did what hurt you?" he demanded. Jane shook her head, her eyes wide. "Touch me," she encouraged softly. "Find my most private heat. You may look for it wherever you wish," she encouraged, eyes sparkling. He circled her slowly. She didn't move a muscle. merely stood naked on the stool as he marveled over every inch of her, and when he returned to face her, he sucked in a breath. She'd done it again. Grown more beautiful, her eyes were filled with some lazy dreamy knowing he could only guess at. Glittering and sleepy and desirous, her skin flushed from head to toe. He reached out with both hands and gathered the firm, plump weight of her breasts in his palms. They felt sweet, so sweet. Their eyes met, and she made a soft mewing sound that shivered through him. "Kiss!" "Aye," he said instantly, knowing what she wanted, and lowered his head to the soft pillows of her breasts. Unable to comprehend why he wanted it so badly, he closed his lips over first one nipple, then the next. Not knowing why he did it, his hands slipped between her soft thighs, sought the warmth and wetness. And images assaulted him. He was someone else, a man who knew much of soft thighs and heated loving, a man who'd lost everything, everyone. "Aiden, please dinna go," the child sobbed. "At least wait till Ma and Da come home." "Moat must go now, little one." The man crushed her in his arms, brushing helplessly at her tears. "'Tis only for 5 years. Why, you'll be but a lass of 10 and 3 when Moat return." The man closed his eyes. Moat left a note for Ma and Da. "Nay, Aiden, dinna leave me," the child said, weeping as if her heart would break. "Moat love you." "Ah," Vengeance roared, thrusting her away, clutching his head with both hands. He bellowed wordlessly, backing away until his spine hit the wall. "Aiden, what is it?" Jane cried, jumping off the stool and scurrying toward him. "Duna, call me that," he shouted, his palms clamped to his temples. "But Aiden." "Had your wished, woman." "But mort think you were remembering," she said frantically, trying to touch him, to soothe him. Another wordless bellow was his only reply as he raced from the hall as if all the hounds of hell were nipping at his heels. 11. And above all else would be unwise to seek the company of female humans or permit them to touch you. And it would be unwise. How had he overlooked such nonspecific phrasing? It would be unwise. Vengeance didn't feel particularly wise at the moment, nor did he intend to eat bland food, nor did he intend to circumvent Kylekin because it might be best. Just as he'd begun to suspect, his king had in truth not issued a single order at all. How and when did Mort meet him? Vengeance wondered for the first time. Had he been born in Fairy, pledged to the king from birth? Had he met him in later years? Why could he remember? Vengeance sat in silence beside the gently lapping ocean, slapping the blade of a dirk against his palm. Fade didn't bleed, they healed too quickly. Vengeance made a fist around the blade. Blood seeped from his clenched hand and dripped down the sides. He spread his fingers and studied the deep cuts. They remained deep, oozing dark crimson blood. A harsh, relieved breath escaped him. How old was he? How long had he lived? Why could he not recall ever changing? Why did humans gray on their heads? Yet Vengeance remained unchanged. Nothing changes in Fairy. If he never went back, would his long black hair one day turn silver too? Strangely, the thought appealed to him. Thoughts of a child rose unbidden in his mind. He imagined hugging one of the wee village lasses in his arms, wiping away her tears. Teaching her to climb trees, to make boats out of wood and sail them in the surf, bringing her a litter of mewing kittens whose mother had died birthing them. "Who emote?" Vengeance cried, clutching his head. It occurred to him that in truth mayhap the right question was, who had he once been? Jane watched him from the front steps of the castle. He sat vacepta, had his back to her in the deepening twilight, clutching his head, staring out to sea. Blood was smeared on one of his hands, dripping down his arm. Suddenly he stood up, and she caught a gleam of silver as he flung a blade end over end into the waves. A salty breeze whipped at his hair, tangling the dark strands into a silken skein. His plaid flapped in the breeze, hugging the powerful lines of his body. He seemed dark and desolate and strong and utterly untouchable. Janus' eyes misted. "Mote love you, Aiden McKinnon," she told the wind. As if the wind eagerly whisked her words down the front lawn to the sea's edge, Aiden suddenly turned and looked straight at her. His cheeks gleamed wetly in the fading light. He nodded once, then turned his back to her and walked off down the shore, head bowed. Jane started after him, then stopped. There'd been such desolation in his gaze, such loneliness, yet a great deal of anger. He'd had turned away, clearly demonstrating his wish to be alone. She didn't want to push him too hard. She couldn't even begin to understand what he was going through. She was elated that he was remembering and equally anguished by the pain it was causing him. She watched, torn by indecision, until he disappeared around a bend in the rocky shoreline. 12. He didn't come back for 3 days. They were the most agonizing 3 days of Jane Silius' life. Daily, she cursed herself for pushing him too far, too fast daily. She berated herself for not going after him. when he'd begun walking down that rocky shore. Daily, she lied to the villagers when they came to work, assuring them he'd only gone to see a man about a horse and would return anon. And nightly, as she curled with Sexspot in the bed that was much too large for just one lonely girl, she prayed her words would prove true. On 13, it was the middle of the night when Aidan returned. He awakened her abruptly, stripping the coverlets from her naked body, sending Sexspot flying from the bed with a disgruntled meow. Aidan, Jane gasped, staring up at him. His expression was so fierce that her sleep-fogged brain cleared instantly. He stood at the foot of the bed, his dark gaze sweeping every inch of her nude body. He'd braided his hair, his face was dark, with the stubble of a black beard shadowing his jaw. In the past few weeks he'd lost weight, and although he was still powerfully muscular, there was a leanness to him, a dangerously hungry look, like a wolf too long alone and unfed in the wild. He didn't say a word, just stripped off his shirt and kicked off his boots, then moved toward her. She never would have believed it of herself, but he radiated such barely harnessed fury that she scuttled back against the headboard and crossed her arms over her breasts protectively. "Knock, nay, lass," he said with silky menace. "Not after all the times you've tried to get me to touch you, you willna naysay me now." Jane's eyes grew huge. "Touch me." He unknotted his plaid and let it fall to the floor. Jane's jaw dropped. She tried again and failed again. "Is something wrong with me?" he demanded. "No way." She swallowed hard. "And this?" He palmed his formidable erection. "This is as it should be?" Oh, Jane breathed reverently. "Absolutely." He eyed her suspiciously. "You're not just saying that, are you?" Jane shook her head, her eyes wide. "Then give me those kisses of yours, lass, and be quick about it." He paused a moment, then added in a low, tense voice, "Mut ma cold, lass, mut met so cold." Jane's breath hitched in her throat and her eyes misted. His vulnerability melted her fears. She rose to her knees on the bed and extended her hands to him, never breaking eye contact, staring into her eyes, as if the invitation in them was all that was sustaining him. He placed his hands slowly in hers and let her pull him onto the bed, where he knelt facing her. She glanced down at their entwined hands, and his gaze followed. Her hands were small and white, nearly swallowed by his work-roughened and tanned fingers. She flexed her fingers against his, savoring the first real feel of holding Aidan's hand. Until that moment she'd only touched him in her dreams. She closed her eyes, savoring every bit of it, drinking the experience dry. She opened them to find him, regarding her with expectancy and fascination. "Sometimes mut think mut know you, lass." "You do," she said with a little catch in her voice. "Mote met Jane, you're Jane," she longed to cry. And then he hesitated a long moment. "Aidan McKinnon." Jane stared at him wonderingly. "You've remembered?" she exclaimed. "Oh, Eden." He cut her words off with a gentle finger against her lips. "Does it matter? The villagers think Mort am. You think Mort am. Why should Mort not be?" Jane's heart sank again. He still didn't recall. But he was here, and he was willing to let her touch him. She would take what she could get. "Jane," he said urgently, "am truly as a man should be." "Everything a man should be," she assured him. "And then teach me what a man does with a woman such as you." Her heart purred. The look in his eyes was so innocent and hopeful, nearly masking the ever-present despair in his gaze. "First," she said softly, raising his hand to her lips, "he kisses her like so." She planted a sweet kiss in his palm and closed his fingers over it. He did the same with both her hands, lingering over the sensitive skin of her palm. And then she breathed. He lets her touch him all over, like this. She slid her hands up his muscular arms and into his hair. Removing his leather thong, she combed her fingers through the plait until it fell dark and silky around his face. She laid her palms against his face, staring into his eyes. He was still beneath her touch, his eyes unfocused. "More," he urged, a stray tomcat, starved for touch. "And she touches him here," she said, skimming his shoulders, the muscles of his back, down over his lean hips, and back up his magnificent abs and muscled chest. Unable to resist, she dropped her head forward against his chest and licked him, tasting the salt of his skin. A rough groan escaped him, and the heat of his arousal throbbed insistently against her thigh. Jane whimpered at the contact and pressed against him. She tasted his neck, his jaw, his lips, and buried her hands in his hair. Then he brushes his lips. "Won't know this part," he said, sounding pleased with himself. Fitting his mouth to hers, he kissed her, a deep, starving soul kiss, and dragged her hard against his body. The feel of her naked body against his bare skin made his head swim, made him burn, made him tremble with wonder. He'd never known, he'd never suspected what pleasure was to be found in touch. The feel of her wee hands on his body made him hotter than any fire could, and brought him crashing to his knees inside himself. She'd said that he was fashioned as a man should be, and she touched him as if she desperately craved his body. He liked that. It made him just feel and feel and feel. He nibbled and suckled at her lips, then plunged his tongue deeply, thrusting. His body moved to a rhythm innate and primal. She went supple in his arms, dropping back onto the bed, and he followed, stretching his body atop her lush softness. Christ, lass, mote ne'er felt aught such as you. Intoxicated, he kissed her deeply, his silky hot tongue tangling there kept at hers. When she shifted her legs beneath him, the swollen part of him was suddenly flush between her thighs, and he thrust against her instinctively. When she raised her hips, pressing back, and he thought he would die from such sensation, he cupped her bottom and pulled her more firmly against him. Digging his fingers into the softness of her bare bottom filled him with a wild and fierce sensation, an urge to possess, to hold her beneath him until she wept at pleasure. Until he shuddered atop her, images came to him then, of a man and a woman rolling naked across a bed, of the firm pistoning motion of a man's hips, of slender ankles and calves raised near a woman's breasts, of the musky scent of skin and bodies, the sweat and rawness and heat of— "You have no clan, you have no home," the Dark King said. "Nay, mote have clan all o'er the Highlands, my home." 'Twas the thought of his clan that sustained him, along with yet a more exquisite thought. But the king had tried to steal that other most important thought from him, so he'd had built a tower of ice around it to keep it safe. "Everyone in your clan died 100 years ago, you fool. Forget." "Nay, my people are not dead," but he knew they were. Naught but dust returned to the Highland soil. "Everyone for whom you cared is dead. The world goes on without you. You are my vengeance, the beast who serves my bidding." And then the darker images, as the unending pain began and went on until there was nothing left but a single frozen tear and ice where once had beat a heart that held the hallowed blood of Scottish kings. He pushed her away, roaring. Stunned, Jane fell back on the bed. Bewildered by his abrupt leave-taking, she stammered, What?" She shook her head, trying to clear it, to understand what was happening. 1 minute he'd been about to make wildly passionate love to her. The next he was 5 feet away, looking horrified. "Why did you stop?" "Can't do this," he shouted. "It hurts too much." "Aidan, it's just." "Nay, mote canna," lass, eyes wild, trembling visibly, he turned and stormed from the bedchamber. But not before she saw the remembering in his dark gaze. Not before she saw the first faint hint of awareness of who and what he really was. "Oh, she breathed to the empty room, chills shivered down her spine. And he did. She'd seen it in his gaze, in the pain etched in his face, in the stiffness of his body. He'd left her moving like a man who'd gone 10 rounds in the ring, whose ribs were bruised, whose body was contused from head to toe. She had the sudden terrifying feeling that he might leave her, that he might simply go back to his king so that he wouldn't have to face what he would now have to face. "Aidan," she cried, leaping up from the bed and chasing after him. But the castle was empty. Aidan was gone. 14. Jane trod dispiritedly into the castle. Shudder slumped. It had been a week since Aidan had left, and she had only 2 more days before whatever was going to happen would happen. She had no idea exactly what would come to pass, but she was pretty certain he would be gone from her, forever. No longer in this castle, no longer even in her dreams. Leaving her to a life of what? Only memories of dreams that nothing could ever compare to. Reluctant to go in search of him, in case he returned only to find her gone, she'd been crying off and on for a week. She'd barely been able to converse with the villagers when they came to labor every day. The castle was progressing, but to what avail? When both the laird and lady would likely be gone in a matter of 48 hours, no more. How she would miss this place. The wild, rugged land, the honest, hard-working people who knew how to find joy in the smallest of things. Sniffing back tears, she mewed for Sexbot, who for a change didn't come scampering across the stone floor, tail swishing flirtatiously. Glancing around with tear-blurred eyes, she drew up short. Aidan was sitting before the hearth, feet resting on a stool, with Sexbot curled on his lap. As if him being there, petting the wee useless beastie, was to astonishing enough, he'd propped the painting Elias had unearthed weeks ago against the table facing him, and was staring at it. She must have made some small sound, because without looking up, hand moving gently over the kitten, "Silvery fur," he said. "Mote walked about the Highlands a bit. One of the villagers was kind enough to ferry me to the mainland." Jane opened her mouth, then closed it again. Such intense relief flooded her that she nearly crumpled to her knees. She still had 2 more days to try. "Thank you, God," she whispered silently. Much has changed, he said slowly. Little was familiar to me, Mot loete my bearings a time or two. Oh, Aidan, she said gently. Mort needed to know this place again, and Mort supposed Mort needed time. You don't have to explain, she hastened to assure him. The mere fact that he'd returned was enough. She'd nearly given up hope. But Mort do, he said, staring fixedly at the portrait. There is much Mort need to explain to you. You have a right to know, that is, he added carefully, if you still wish to share these quarters with me. Mort still wished to share these quarters, Aidan, she said instantly. Some of the tension seemed to leave his body. How could she make him understand that she wished not only to share quarters but her body and her heart? She longed to share everything with him. But there was something she had to know, words she needed to hear him say. Do you know who you are yet? She held her breath, waiting. When he looked at her levelly, a bittersweet smile playing faintly upon his lips. Och, aye, lass, Modum Aidan McKinnon, son of Findanis and Mary McKinnon from Dun Hakon on the Isle of Skye, born in 898, twice removed grandson of Kenneth MacAlpin, and Modum the last of my people. He turned his gaze back to the portrait. His words, delivered so regally, yet with such sorrow, sent a chill up her spine. Beyond that, you need only tell me what you wish, she said softly. And then, Mort bid you listen well, for Mort do na ken when Mort may have the will to speak it again. That said, he grew pensively silent and gazed into the fire as if searching for the right words. Finally he stirred and said, When Mot was 10 a man of sorts came to this castle. At first Mot thought that he'd come to challenge me, for Mot was heralded the most powerful warrior in all the Isles, descended from the mighty MacAlpin himself. Mayhap Mot was a bit pleased with myself. He grimaced self-deprecatingly. But this man, he trailed off, shaking his head. This man terrified even me. He looked like a man, but he was dead inside. Ice-cold, not human, but human Mot Cano Ove kept that does to make sense. But 'twas as if all the life had been sucked from him somehow. And yet still he breathed. I feared he would harm my people and mock me while doing so. He was great and tall and wide, and he had powers beyond mortal. When he paused, lost in his memories, Jane whispered, Please go on. He took a deep breath. Ma and Da were away at sea with all my siblings, but the youngest. Mot was here with my wee sister. He gestured to the portrait, rose. He closed his eyes and rubbed them. Although Mot may have suffered my share of arrogance, lass, all Mortier wished for was a family children of my own, to watch my sisters and brothers grow and raise their children. To live a simple life, to be a man of honor. A man that when he was laid into the earth, others said he was a good man. Yet on that day Motkano avacate that such things would ne'er come to pass, for the man who had come for me threatened to destroy my entire world, and Motkano avacate he could do it. Eyes misting, Jane hurried to him, sank onto the footstool, and placed a gentle, encouraging hand on his thigh. He covered it with his own, staring at the portrait. After a few moments he turned his head and looked at her, and she gasped softly at the anguish in his eyes. She wanted to press kisses to his eyelids as if to somehow kiss all the pain away, to make sure nothing ever hurt him again. Mot made a deal with the creature that if he left my clan in peace, Mot would go with him to his king. His king offered a bargain, and Mot accepted, thinking 5 years would be a hellish price to pay, wondering how Mot could withstand 5 years in his icy dark kingdom. But it was near 5 years. Last 'twas 500 years, and Mot forgot. I forgot. He slammed a fist down on the arm of the chair. Thrusting the kitten at her, he leaped to his feet and began pacing. Sexpot, alarmed by the sudden commotion, scampered off for the calm of the bedchamber. Mot became just like him. The one who had come to claim me, I lost all honor. Mot became the vilest of vile, Tehat-E. Stop, Jane cried. Mot became that thing I despised, lass. You were tortured, she defended. Who could survive 5 centuries of if she trailed off, not knowing what he'd withstood? Aidan snorted angrily. Mot let them go to escape the things that the king did to me. Mot let memories of my clan, of my rose go. The more Mot forgot, the less he punished me. God, there are things in the Dark King's realm. Things so, he snarled, shaking his head. You had to forget, Jane said intensely. It's a miracle that you survived, and although you might think you became this vengeance creature who came for you, you did Mot saw the goodness in you when Mot came here. I saw the tenderness, the part of you that was aching to be a simple man again. But you do not know the things M've done, he said, his voice harsh and deep and unforgiving. Mot don't need to know, unless you wish to tell me. Mot need never know. All Mot need to know is that you are never going back to him. You are never going back to him, are you? Jane pressed. He said nothing, just stood there looking lost and full of self-loathing, his head bowed, his hair curtaining his face. Stay with me, Mot want you, Aidan, she said, her heart aching. How could you? How could anyone? He asked bitterly. Ah, she thought, understanding. He hungered to be part of the mortal world. That was why he'd come back to Dunhaken, rather than turning to his king. But he felt he did to deserve it. He feared no one would want him, that once she knew what he'd been, she would cast him out. He glanced at her, then quickly glanced away, but not before she saw the hope warring with the despair in his gaze. Rising to her feet, Jane held out her hand. "Take my hand, Aidan, that's all you need do. You do know what these hands have done. Take my hand, Aidan. Begone, lass, a woman such as you is not for the likes of me." "Take my hand," she repeated. "You can take it now, or 10 years from now, or 20, because Moat will still be standing here waiting for you to take my hand. Moat met not leaving you. Moat met never leaving you." His anguished gaze shot to hers. "Why?" "Because Mutt love you," Jane said, her eyes filling with tears. "Mutt love you, Aidan McKinnon. Mutt loved you forever." "Who are you? Why do you even care about me?" His voice rose and cracked hoarsely. "You still didn't remember me?" Jane asked plaintively. Aidan thought hard, pushing into the deepest part of him, that part that still was iced over. A hard, shining tower of ice still lay behind his breast, concealing something. Helplessly, he shook his head. Jane swallowed hard. It didn't really matter, she told herself. He didn't have to remember their time together in the dreaming. She could live with that if it meant she could spend the rest of her life here on this island with him. "It's okay," she said finally, with a brave smile. "You don't have to remember me as long as you—" She broke off abruptly, feeling suddenly too vulnerable for words. "As long as Moat what, lass?" In a small voice she finally said, "Do you think you could care for me? In the way a man cares for his woman?" Aidan sucked in a harsh breath, if only she knew. For the week he'd wandered, he'd thought of little else, knowing he should do her the favor of never returning, yet unable to stay away. Dreaming of her, waking to find his arms reaching for nothing. Until unable to push her from his heart, he'd faced his memories until, scorning himself for a fool, he'd returned to Dunhaken, to force her to force him to leave, to see the disgust in her gaze, to be sent away so he could die inside. But now she stood there, hands outstretched, asking him to stay, asking him to make free with her body and heart, offering him a gift he hadn't deserved but vowed to earn. "You wished that of me, Mort, who was scarce human when you met me. You could have any man you wished, lass, any of the villagers, nay, even Scotia's king. Mort want only you, or no one ever. You would trust me so, to be your man? Mort trust you already." Aidan stared at her. He began to speak several times, then closed his mouth again. "If you refuse me, Mort Luglung cast myself into the sea," she announced dramatically, "and die, not really because Jane Silly wasn't a quitter, but he needn't know that." "Nay, oh, you will not go to the sea," he roared, eyes glittering. He moved toward her. "Mort, I'm so lonely without you, Aidan," Jane said simply. "You truly want me?" "More than anything. Moat met only half without you." "Then you are my woman." His words were finality, a bond he would not permit broken. She had given herself to his keeping. He would never let her go. "And you, Luglung, never leave me," she pressed. "Mut Luglung stay with you for all of ever, lass." Jane's eyes flared, and she looked at him strangely. "And then yet another day?" she asked breathlessly. "Oh, aye." "And we could have babies?" "Half-dozen, if you wish." "Could we start making them now?" "Oh, aye." A grin touched his lips. The first full grin she'd ever seen on his gorgeous face. The effect was devastating. It was a dangerous, knowing grin that dripped sensual promise. "Mort should warn you," he said, his eyes glittering. "Mort recall what it is to be a man now, lass, all of it. And Mort was ever a man of greedy and demanding appetites." "Oh, please," Jane breathed, "be as greedy as you wish. Demand away." "Mort will begin small," he said, his eyes sparkling. "We will begin with the pressing of the lips you so favor," he teased. Jane flung herself at him, and when his arms closed around her, she went wild, touching and kissing and clinging to him. "Woman, Mort need you," he growled, slanting his mouth across hers. Ever since Mort remembered the things a man knows, all Mort could think of were the things Mort ached to do to you. "Show me," she whimpered. And he did, taking his sweet time, peeling away her gown until she was naked before him, kissing and suckling and tasting every inch of her. He experienced no difficulty whatsoever finding her most private heat. 15. The Unsea King sensed it. The precise moment he lost his vengeance. Though the mortal Highlander had not yet regained full memory, he loved and was loved in return. The king's visage changed in a manner most rare for him. The corners of his lips turned up. Humans, he thought mockingly, so easily manipulated. How infuriated they would be if they knew it had never been about them to begin with, and indeed rarely was. His vengeance had performed precisely as he'd expected, twisting his 3 nebulous suggestions, and with obstinate human defiance aiding the king in his aim. Eons ago, a young Seelie queen for whom he suffered an unending hunger had escaped him before he'd been through with her. She'd not risked entering his realm again. His smile grew. If he must stoop to conquer, it was not beneath him. When he swallowed a laugh, tossed his head back, and let loose an enraged roar that resonated throughout the fabric of the universe. The Seelie queen heard the Dark King's cry and permitted herself a small private smile. And so she mused, feeling quite lovely he had lost and she had won. It made her feel positively magnanimous. Sipping the nectar from a splendidly plump Dallasonia, she rolled onto her back and stretched languidly. Perhaps she should offer the Dark King her condolences, she mused. After all, they were royalty, and royalty did that sort of thing. And after all, she had won. And she could simply duck in and back out, gloat a bit. And if he tried to restrain her, keep her captive in his realm, she laughed softly. She'd have beaten him this time. She'd have proved that she was stronger than she'd have been millennia ago, when he'd have caged her for a time. Feeling potent, inebriated on victory, she closed her eyes and envisioned his icy lair. When the iciness of his realm stole her breath away, then she saw him and inhaled sharply, sucking in great lungfuls of icy air. Her memory had not done him justice. He was even more exotic than she'd recalled. A palpable darkness surrounded him. He was deadly and powerful, and she knew from intimate experience just how inventively, exhaustively erotic he was. A true master of pain, he understood pleasure as no other could. "My queen," he said, his eyes of night and ice glittering. Even as powerful as the Seelie queen was, she found it impossible to gaze into his eyes for more than a moment. Some claimed they'd been emptied of matter and pure chaos had been spooned into the sockets. She inclined her head, averting her gaze ever so slightly. "It would seem you have lost your vengeance, Dark One," she murmured. "It would seem mote have." When he rose from his throne of ice, and rose, she caught her breath. Not quite fairy, his blood mixed with the blood of a creature even the Fae hesitated to name. His shadow moved unnaturally as he rose, slithering around him, wont to move independently of its host. "You seem unperturbed by your defeat, Dark One," she probed, determined to savor every drop of her victory. "Care you not that you have lost him? 5 centuries of work. Wasted. You presume you knew my aim." When the Seelie queen stiffened, staring into his eyes for a moment longer than was wise. "Pretend not that you intended to lose. That might have been manipulated." Her voice dripped ice worthy of his kingdom. "Loss is a relative thing." "I won. Admit it," she snapped. "Mort doubt you even knew what game we played, young one." His voice deep, silky, and mesmerizing, he mocked. "Did you come to gloat because my defeat made you feel powerful? Did it make you feel safe in seeking me? Careful. A being such as Moat might be inclined to find you reason to condescend, to sink to my depths." "Moat have sunk to nothing," she hissed, feeling suddenly foolish. She was young by his standards, for the King of Darkness was ancient, sprung from the loins of an age she'd heard of only in legend. He said nothing, merely regarded her, his stare a palpable weight. She repressed a shiver, remembering her last excursion to his land. She'd nearly failed to summon the power to leave. But she conceded with a thrill of sexual anticipation so intense that it nearly brought her to her knees. She'd not quite been in a hurry to leave the Dark King's dangerous bed, and therein lay double the danger. "Moat came to offer my condolences," she said coolly. His laughter alone could seduce, so offer, my queen. He moved in a swirl of darkness. "But offer that for Ve Kephatik Shahat. We both know you hunger your willing surrender." And when he was upon her, when he had gathered her up and his great wings began to flap, she let her head fall against his icy breast, darkness so thick that it had texture and taste surrounded her. "Never. Heed me well, light one. The only thing you are never with me is safe." Much later, when he possessed her completely, a full blood moon stained the sky above the Highlands of Scotland. Aidan made love to Jane like a man who understood that this day, this moment, only this now was securely in the palm of his hand, taking her with the passionate urgency of a 10th century Scotsman who knew not what tomorrow might bring, brutal war, drought, or crop-destroying tempest. He made love like a drowning man, desperate for the surety of her body. She was his shore, his raft, his harbor against what storms may come. And then he made love to her again. This time with exquisite gentleness, brushed his lips against the warm hollow of her neck in which her heartbeat pulsed, kissed the slopes of her breasts, tasted the salt of her skin and the sweetness of her passion glistening between her thighs, and flexed himself deep within her innermost warmth. He became part of her, Finally, he knew the kind of loving that made two one and understood Jane was his world, his ocean, his country, his sun, his rain, his very heart. And that sleek, iced citadel behind his breastbone, behind which he'd concealed from the Dark King that which was most infinitely precious to him, cracked at the foundations and came crashing down. And he finally remembered what he'd sealed away there, his Jane. "Jane, my own sweet Jane," he cried hoarsely. Jane's eyes flew wide. He was buried deep within her, loving her slowly and intensely, and although he'd called her name aloud many times during the loving, his voice sounded different this time. Could it be? He'd finally remembered all of it, all those years they had spent together in dreams, playing and loving and dancing and loving. Aiden, his name held the question she was afraid to ask. When framing her head with his forearms, he stared down at her. "You came to me, Moat, remember now. You came when Moat slept in the dreaming." "Yes," Jane cried, joyous tears misting her eyes. There were no words for a time, only the soft sounds of passion, of a woman being thoroughly loved by her man. When finally she could catch her breath again, she said, "You were with me always. You watched me grow up, remember?" She laughed self-consciously. "When Mott was 13, Mott nearly dreaded seeing you, because Mott was so of a Kepkai. Nay, you were no such thing. You were a wee, lovely lass. Moat watched your womanhood ripening and saw what you would become. Moat ached for the day you would be old enough that Moat could love you in every way." "Well, you didn't have to wait quite so long," she voiced a long-harbored complaint. She added, gasping, when he nipped her nipple lightly with his teeth. "Do that again." He did, and again until her breasts felt ripe and exquisitely sensitive. Then he rubbed his unshaven cheek lightly against her peaked nipples, creating delicious friction. "When Moat claimed you when you were 10 and 8, he managed finally. "Like I said Moat was ready way before then. Moat was ready by 16 ooh. When you were a wee babe still," he said indignantly, stilling inside her. "Don, stop," she gasped. "Doona think for a minute 'twasn't difficult for me to naysay you. 'Twas that my mother insisted all her sons forego impatience and give a last time to be a child before having bairn of her own. And please," she whimpered. Heeding her plea, he thrust without cease, and she cried out his name over and again, digging her fingers into his muscular hips, pulling him as deep as she could take him. He kissed her, taking her cries with his lips until her shudders subsided. "Have you had time enough, wee Jane?" he asked later, when she lay drowsy and sated in his arms. "We may have made one this very day, you can." Jane beamed. His shimmering eyes were again a warm tropical surf in his dark face, his lips curved with sensuality and tenderness. He'd finally remembered her, and she might have his baby growing inside her. "Mort want half a dozen at least," she assured him, smiling. And then she sobered, touching his jaw lightly. When Mort was 22, the dreams seemed different. They became repeats of earlier dreams. His jaw tensed beneath her hand. "Mort lost you," she said. "Did Mort?" "The king discovered Mort was gaining strength from my dreams. He prevented me from joining you there," Aiden said tersely. She inhaled sharply. "How?" she asked, not certain she wanted to know. "You doona wish to know, and Morduna need to speak of it. 'Tis over and done," he said, his eyes darkening. Jane didn't press and let it go for now, knowing the time would come when he would need to speak of it, and she would be there to listen. For now she would wait while Aiden became fully Aiden again. He smiled suddenly, dazzling her. "You were my light, wee Jane, my laughter, my hope, my love, and now you will be my wife." "Ahem," she said pertly. "If you think you getting off with that lame proposal, you have another thought coming." He laughed. "Your headstrong nature was one of the first things Moat favored in you, last so Moshe hot fire, and as cold as Moat was, your tempers kept me warm, saucy like my mother, demanding like my sisters, yet tender of heart and weak of will when it comes to passion." "Who are you calling weak?" she said with mock indignation. Adon gave her a provocative glance from beneath half-lowered lids. "'Tis obvious you have a weakness for me. You spent the past fortnight trying to seduce me. Only because you'd forgotten me. Otherwise you would have been chasing me around." Certain of it, she scrambled from beneath him and slipped from the bed, then dashed out into the great hall. Sure enough, he followed, stalking her like a great greedy dark beast. And when he caught her, he made wild, passionate love to her. Celestial music trumpeted from the heavens, it did Mort swear. Rainbows gathered to shimmer above Dun Hakan. Heather bloomed, and even the sun's brilliance paled in comparison to the luminosity of true love. And when he proposed again, it was on bended knee, with a band of gold embedded with tiny heart-shaped rubies, as he vowed to love her for all of ever. Then yet another day. From the unpublished manuscript, Highland Fire by Jane McKinnon. Epilogue. Don't forget. Chapter Adon, Jane reminded, as he slipped from their bed. I missed last week, and Henna said they're going to storm the castle, if Mordaunt let them know what's going on with Beth and Duncan. I want to forget, lest donning shirt and plaid Aidan picked up the parchments from the side table. He glanced at the top page. When she held her breath, waiting for him to kiss her, knowing that she would never be the same once she'd tasted the passion of his embrace. Her braw Highlander had fought valiantly for the Bruce, and had come home to her wounded in body and heart. But she would heal him. You know, the men say that since their wives have been reading your tales, they re much more amorous, Aidan told her. Downright body, the men had actually said insatiable, plotting ways to seduce their men at all hours. Her stories had the same effect on him. Reading one of her love scenes never failed to make him hard as a rock. He wondered if she suspected that before delivering her pages to the eager women, he stopped in the tavern where the husbands listened, with much jesting and guffawing, as he read the most recent installment. Although they made sport of the mushy parts, not one of them failed to show each Tuesday when he made his weekly trip to the village. Last week 3 of them had come looking for him when he'd failed to appear with that week installment. Really, Jane was delighted. Aye, he said, grinning. They thank you for it. Jane beamed. As he pulled on his boots, she reminded him, oh, and don't forget moat want peach ice, not blueberry. Moat willna forget, he promised. You've got the entire village making your favorite dish. Moat vow when the spring thaws come and they can make your icy cream, they may go mad. Jane smiled. She'd been unable to resist teaching the villagers a few things that she deemed reasonably harmless. It wasn't like she was advancing technology before its time. Pushing the drapes aside, she glanced out the window behind the bed. It snowed again last night. Look, isn't it beautiful, Aidan? She exclaimed. Aidan pulled the drapes back over the window and tucked the covers more securely around her. Aye, 'tis lovely, and damned cold. Are you warm enough? He worried. Without waiting for her reply, he stacked several more logs on the fire and banked it carefully. Mort Doomna want you getting out of bed. You mustn't catch a chill. Jane made a face. Moat met not that pregnant, Aidan. Moat still have 2 more months. Moat willna take any chances with you or our daughter. Son. Daughter. Jane's laughter was cut off abruptly when he took her in his arms and kissed her long and hard before leaving. At the doorway he paused. If 'tis a lass, he asked softly, do you think we might name her Rose? Oh yes, Aidan, Jane said softly, more like that. After he left, Jane lay back against the pillows, marveling 7 months had passed since her arrival at Dunhaken, and although there'd been some difficult moments, she wouldn't have traded it for anything in the world. Aidan still had a great deal of darkness inside him, of times and things he rarely discussed. There had been somber months while he grieved the loss of his clan, and then finally, one morning, she'd come down from their new bedchamber above stairs and found him hanging the old portraits in the great hall. She'd watched him, praying he wouldn't have that stark expression in his eyes. When he raised his head and smiled at her, her heart had soared. "'Tis time to honor the past," he'd told her. "We have a rich history, lass Mort, want our children to know their grandparents." And then he'd made love to her. There in the great hall, they'd rolled across the floor, paused for a heated interlude on the table, and ended up, she recalled, blushing in a most interesting position over a chair. When all of her dreams had come true. The village women waited vacape, hot bated breath for the latest installment of her serial novel. They lapped up every word, savoring the romance, and the magic of it spilled over into their hearth and home, and no one ever complained about purple prose or typos. She was a storyteller with an eager audience, a mother-to-be, had a milking cow of her own, reasonably hot water, the scent of her man all over her skin, and she slept each night held tightly in the arms of the man she loved. Dreamily she sighed, resting her hand on her tummy. Sexpot gave a little pink-tongued yawn and snuggled closer beside her. Life was good.